The mountain remembers what men forget. On the frontier where civilization breaks apart, Deputy Silas Vane learns too late that some chains cannot be broken with iron, and some debts are paid in blood darker than any he has spilled. Escorting a captured woman through plague-torn wilderness, he believes the worst danger walks on two legs, until a stolen relic awakens something that has waited generations to feed. What hunts them now wears human faces but remembers when this land belonged to older, hungrier things. Before you witness how far terror can reach, hit that like button and comment your city below. Let's see how far this nightmare travels. The iron bit deep into Delia Cross's wrists, each jolt of the wagon sending fresh pain through the raw meat where the shackles had worn away skin. She didn't cry out, hadn't cried out in 3 days, not when they'd dragged her from the burned-out ranch. Not when the deputy had cinched the chains tight enough to cut circulation, not when the fever-sick marshal in the wagon bed beside her had vomited blood across her boots. She just watched the mountains rise ahead through eyes that had seen worse than most men twice her age. Deputy Silas Vane rode point, 26 years old, and certain he knew everything about frontier justice worth knowing. His jaw carried the hard set of a man who'd learned early that hesitation got you killed. His hands bore the calluses of someone who'd rather grip a rifle than shake on promises. The star pinned to his chest caught the late afternoon sun, throwing brief flashes of light across the rutted trail that passed for a road through this godforsaken stretch of Wyoming territory. Behind him, the wagon groaned under the weight of Marshal Hickman's dying bulk. The old lawman had caught the fever 2 settlements back, somewhere between the burned trading post and the river crossing where they'd found 3 homesteaders face down in shallow water with their throats opened to the bone. Doc Farrell had said Hickman might have a week. That was 4 days ago. How much further? The voice came from Sarah Pruitt, one of the 7 civilians who'd attached themselves to the marshal's transport like barnacles to a sinking ship. She sat rigid on the wagon bench, clutching her medicine bag with white-knuckled desperation. Her husband Thomas walked alongside, rifle cradled in arms that hadn't stopped shaking since they'd left Fort Granger. 3 days to Fort Callahan if we push hard, Silas said without turning. 2 if Hickman holds and we don't hit trouble. Trouble? Thomas Pruitt laughed, the sound sharp and brittle as breaking glass. Like the kind of trouble that took the Miller family? Or the kind that left those hunters strung up in the pines with their guts painting the snow? That was animals, Silas said, but his voice carried less conviction than it had a week ago. Mountain cats, maybe wolves. Wolves don't take the eyes and leave the rest. This from Delia, her first words in hours. Her voice was low, roughened by days of breathing dust and speaking to people who treated her like cargo. Wolves don't arrange the bodies in patterns, and they sure as hell don't make the tracks we've been seeing. Silas finally turned in his saddle, fixing her with the cold stare that had made stronger men look away. You're a prisoner, Mrs. Cross. Your opinions on predator behavior aren't required. My husband's gang rode these mountains for 5 years, Delia said, meeting his stare with eyes the color of storm clouds. They knew every trail, every cave, every place white men weren't welcome. 3 months ago, half of them rode into the high country and never came back. The ones who returned, she paused, something flickering behind her gaze that might have been genuine fear. They weren't right. Talked about things in the dark, shapes that moved wrong, voices that came from dead mouths. Your husband's gang were murderers and thieves, Silas said. If they saw demons in the dark, it was guilt talking. My husband was a murderer and a thief, Delia corrected, her voice flat. But he wasn't crazy, and he wasn't a liar. The last thing he said before they hanged him was, "Don't go near the high ground. Don't take what isn't yours." Then he looked at me like he was seeing something standing behind my shoulder, and he screamed until the rope cut it short. Silence fell across the group like a shroud. Even the wagon wheels seemed to quiet. The only sound, the labored breathing of the dying marshal and the whisper of wind through the pines that crowded close on both sides of the trail. They'd been climbing since dawn, following the old trader's route that cut through the heart of the mountain range. It was faster than the lowland roads, but it took them through country that most settlers avoided even in the best of times. The trees here grew different, twisted and dark, their bark rough as dried blood, their branches reaching across the trail like skeletal fingers trying to drag the sky down to earth. Deputy? The voice was thin, wet with blood and fever. Marshal Hickman was struggling to sit up, one hand clutching the wagon's side rail, the other pressed to his chest where the sickness had turned his skin the color of old bruises. "Deputy, we need to turn back." Silas reined his horse to a stop. The animal snorted, ears flicking nervously toward the darkening tree line. "Marshal, lie down. Save your strength." No strength left to save. Hickman's eyes were glassy but sharp, focused with the kind of clarity that sometimes came to dying men in their final hours. "Something's wrong with this place. Can't you feel it? The air tastes like copper, like old blood." "That's the fever talking." "The fever's got nothing to do with what I'm seeing." Hickman raised a shaking hand, pointing toward a gap in the trees where the trail curved around a massive outcropping of granite. "There, in the rocks. You see them?" Silas looked, saw nothing but stone and shadow and the last rays of sunlight painting the granite in shades of rust and amber. "There's nothing there, Marshal. They're watching us." Hickman's voice dropped to a whisper. "They've been watching since we crossed the ridge. Dead eyes, empty faces. They're waiting for something. Waiting for us to—" His words cut off in a gurgling cough that sprayed blood across the wagon bed. Sarah Pruitt moved to help him, but Delia was faster, her shackled hands somehow finding the water skin and pressing it to the old man's lips, despite the iron binding her wrists. "Easy," she murmured, her touch gentle in a way that made Silas reassess everything he'd assumed about her. "Easy now. Breathe slow. Thank you, girl." Hickman's eyes found hers, and for a moment something passed between them, some understanding that came from standing too close to death too many times. "You listen to me now. When it comes, and it will come, you run. Don't think. Don't look back. Just run." "When what comes?" But Hickman's eyes had already rolled back, his body going slack against the wagon boards. "Is he—" Sarah started. "Not yet," Delia said, pressing her ear to his chest. "But soon. Hours, maybe. Not days." Silas dismounted, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a sound like a judge's gavel. "We camp here tonight. Find level ground, get a fire going, post watch in shifts. Nobody wanders off. Nobody goes into the trees alone. Understood?" Nods all around. The group moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd been traveling together long enough to know their roles. Thomas Pruitt and two other men, Franklin Reed and James Corbin, farmers who'd lost their homesteads to the plague and were heading west to start over, began clearing a space for the fire. Sarah and another woman named Mary Dennison saw to the horses and the marshal. Delia sat in the wagon, shackled and still, watching everything with eyes that missed nothing. "You could help," Silas said, approaching with the key to her irons. "Could," she agreed, "if you gave me reason to believe you'd let me keep my hands free once the work was done." He studied her for a long moment. She was thin, worn down by hard travel and harder circumstances, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that spoke of strength held in reserve. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid, framing a face that was all sharp angles and defiant pride. She didn't look like a criminal, but then the worst ones never did. "You try to run," he said, inserting the key into the lock. "I will hunt you down and bring you back in pieces if that's what it takes." "I'm not going to run, Deputy." The shackles fell away with a click, revealing wrists rubbed raw and weeping. "Where would I go? My husband's dead. His gang is scattered. Every lawman from here to California knows my face. I've got nothing left but the truth, and nobody wants to hear that." "What truth?" She rubbed her wrists, not meeting his eyes. "That something evil's loose in these mountains, something that was sleeping until someone woke it up, and now it's hungry." Before Silas could respond, a shout cut through the growing darkness. Franklin Reed stood at the edge of camp, pointing toward something in the trees. "There! Did you see that? Something just moved through the brush." Silas had his pistol out before his conscious mind registered the threat. He moved toward Reed, every sense on high alert, eyes scanning the shadows between the pines. "Where?" "There, no, wait, it was—" Reed's voice trailed off, confusion replacing alarm. "I could have sworn I saw someone standing just past that deadfall. A man, I think, but he was wrong somehow, the way he stood, the way he didn't move." Could be a survivor from one of the homesteads, Thomas Pruitt offered, but his voice lacked conviction. Could be a scout from Boone Mercer's outfit, James Corbin said. Heard they've been ranging through this territory, hitting supply trains and lone travelers. At the mention of Mercer's name, something shifted in Delia's expression. If it's Boone's men, they're not here for supplies. They're here for me. Silas turned to face her. Explain. My husband rode with Boone before they had their falling out. Before Jack decided he wanted to go straight, build a ranch, maybe have a life that didn't end on a gallows. Boone didn't take kindly to that. Said Jack knew too much, had seen too much of Boone's operation to just walk away clean. They were supposed to meet, settle things peaceful. Her laugh was bitter as alkali water. Jack went to that meeting with good intentions. Boone sent him home tied across his saddle with a bullet in his spine. Took him 3 days to die. And you think Mercer's hunting you now? I know things too. Names, places, routes they use to move stolen goods across the territory. If Boone's smart, and he is, he'll tie up every loose end before he makes his next move. I'm a loose end, deputy, a loose end with nothing left to lose. Before Silas could press for more details, another shout erupted from the far side of camp. This time it was Mary Dennison, her voice pitched high with terror. The marshal! Something's wrong with the marshal. They found Hickman sitting upright in the wagon, but nothing about it was natural. His eyes were open, pupils blown so wide the irises had almost disappeared, his mouth working soundlessly like a landed fish gasping for air. His hands clutched at his throat, fingers digging into his own flesh hard enough to draw blood. Sarah pushed past Silas, her medical training overriding her fear. Marshal Hickman, can you hear me? Marshal, I need you to calm down. You're going to hurt yourself. Hickman's gaze fixed on her, and Sarah stumbled backward with a strangled cry. His eyes, she whispered. His eyes are... There's nothing there. No recognition, no humanity. Just empty. Then Hickman spoke, but the voice that emerged from his throat wasn't his own. It was layered, multiple tones woven together like a choir singing in harmony from hell. The words came in a language none of them recognized, harsh and guttural, syllables that hurt to hear. Delia went rigid, her face draining of color. That's the old tongue, the language from before the settlers, before the forts, before any white man set foot in this territory. You recognize it? Silas demanded. My husband made me learn some. Said it might save my life someday, knowing the words the old families used, the original people of this land, before we took it. She listened for a moment longer, her expression growing darker. He's saying something about a theft, about blood debt, about the sleeper who wakes to reclaim what was stolen. Hickman's body convulsed violently, his spine arching until it seemed impossible he wouldn't break in half. Then, as suddenly as it began, the seizure stopped. He collapsed back into the wagon bed, his breathing shallow but steady, his eyes closed. What in the hell was that? Thomas Pruitt's voice shook. Fever dreams, Silas said, but he didn't believe it, couldn't believe it, not after what he'd just witnessed. That wasn't fever. Delia's voice was quiet but certain. That was a warning. Something's been disturbed, something old and angry, and it's using the dying marshal to tell us we're all in danger. They built the fire high that night, flames reaching toward the star-scattered sky like desperate prayers. The group arranged themselves in a loose circle around the blaze, weapons close at hand, sleep an impossibility for most. Silas set the watch schedule, 2 men at a time, rotating every 2 hours, eyes on the darkness beyond the firelight. He took the first watch with James Corbin, a solid man who'd fought in the territorial wars and knew how to keep his head when things went wrong. They sat in silence for the first hour, listening to the night sounds of the mountain, wind through the pines, the distant cry of an owl, the crack and pop of the fire consuming dry wood. Deputy, Corbin said eventually, his voice low so as not to wake the others. You really think this is just animal attacks, sick people seeing things that aren't there? Silas wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that the world made sense, that there were rational explanations for everything they'd seen, but he'd been a lawman long enough to know when he was lying to himself. I don't know what to think anymore, he admitted. Part of me says it's panic. Fear spreads faster than any plague. People see shadows and imagine monsters. But another part, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I've seen things on this trail that don't add up. Tracks that stop in the middle of open ground like whatever made them just vanished. Trees marked with symbols I don't recognize. And the bodies we found, he shook his head. The damage done to them. It wasn't animals. Wasn't human either. Then what? I wish I knew. Movement at the edge of camp caught his attention. Delia stood from where she'd been sitting with her back against the wagon wheel, moving toward the fire with the kind of grace that comes from a lifetime of staying quiet and out of sight. She'd wrapped herself in a blanket, but the firelight still found the sharp lines of her face, the intelligence burning in her eyes. Can't sleep? Silas asked. Don't see much point in trying. She settled near the fire, holding her hands toward the warmth. Figured I might as well be useful. I can watch if you need to rest. You're a prisoner. I can't let you stand watch. I'm a woman who doesn't want to die in these mountains, she corrected. Same as everyone else here. You can trust me for that much at least. Corbin cleared his throat. With respect, Deputy, we could use another set of eyes. And Mrs. Cross has given us no cause to doubt her. Not since we left Fort Granger. Silas considered. Logic said she was right. They needed every able body on alert. But procedure, the weight of his badge, said he couldn't trust a prisoner with camp security. In the end, survival won out over protocol. You see anything at all, you wake me immediately, he said. You try to run, and I swear I'll track me down and bring me back in pieces, Delia finished. I remember. You've made your position clear, Deputy. Trust me when I say I have no desire to test your resolve. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded and moved toward his bedroll. Sleep came hard and haunted, his dreams filled with shapes moving through shadows and voices speaking in tongues that predated English by thousands of years. He woke to screaming. The camp was chaos. People running, shouting, the fire burning low and casting everything in shades of rust and darkness. Silas grabbed his rifle and was on his feet before his mind had fully cleared, instinct and training taking over. What happened? He shouted over the noise. Something took Reed. Thomas Pruitt stood at the edge of camp, pointing toward the trees with a shaking hand. We were on watch together. I turned my back for 1 second, one goddamn second, and when I looked back, he was gone. Just gone. Like the earth swallowed him whole. Which direction? North, toward that old deadfall. I heard something moving in the brush, heavy and fast, and then nothing, just silence. Silas was already moving, rifle up, every sense on high alert. Behind him, he heard Corbin and the other men grabbing weapons, preparing to follow. But it was Delia's voice that stopped him. Don't go out there alone. Don't separate. That's what it wants. What wants? Whatever took your man. She had a rifle too, Thomas Pruitt's spare by the look of it. Her hands were steady on the weapon, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. It's hunting, and hunters separate the herd before they strike. We can't just leave Reed out there. We can't save him if we're dead. Her voice was hard, practical. Wait for first light. Go in force. Watch each other's backs. That's the only way we survive this. Every instinct screamed at Silas to charge into the darkness, to find Reed and bring him back. But years of frontier experience warred with his impulse to act, and in the end, cold logic won. Everybody back to the fire, he ordered. Add more wood. Make it bright enough to see by. Form a circle, weapons out, backs together. Nobody moves until dawn. They waited. Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every shadow a potential threat. Every sound making fingers tighten on triggers. The marshal lay unconscious in the wagon, his breathing growing shallower with each passing minute. Sarah sat beside him, murmuring prayers that didn't seem to reach any heaven that was listening. Dawn came slowly, light seeping through the trees like blood through bandages. When it was bright enough to see by, Silas organized a search party, himself, Corbin, and Thomas Pruitt, with Delia insisting on coming despite his protests. You need someone who knows how to read signs, she said. Someone who's tracked men through country like this before. That's me, Deputy. Use me or leave a man behind, your choice. He let her come. They found Reed 30 yards from camp, in a small clearing dominated by the massive deadfall Thomas had mentioned. What was left of him? The body was arranged like a ritual display, arms spread wide, legs together, forming a cross against the dark earth. His chest had been opened from collarbone to pelvis, ribs spread like the wings of some grotesque bird. His organs were missing, but the ground around him showed no blood. It was as if the life had been drained from him elsewhere, and his corpse brought here for… what? Display? Warning? But it was his face that would haunt Silas for the rest of his days. Reed's eyes were gone, replaced with smooth stones that gleamed wet in the early light. His mouth was stretched in a scream that had been interrupted mid-breath, and carved into his forehead was a symbol none of them recognized: 3 interlocking circles surrounding a 7-pointed star. Jesus Christ, Corbin breathed, turning away to vomit into the brush. Thomas Pruitt just stood there, face blank with shock, unable to process what he was seeing. Delia knelt beside the body, her expression grave but controlled. She'd seen death before. Silas could tell by the way she examined the corpse with professional detachment, checking the wounds, the positioning, the strange symbol. This wasn't random, she said finally. This was precise, ritual. Whoever, whatever, did this knew exactly what it was doing, and it wanted us to find him like this. Why? Silas's voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. To send a message, to mark territory, to warn us. She stood, wiping her hands on her trousers. We need to leave these mountains. Now. Today. Turn around and take the long route to Fort Callahan, even if it adds a week to the journey, because staying on this trail is suicide. We have a dying marshal who won't survive another week of travel, Silas said, and we have no guarantee the long route is any safer. For all we know, this thing has already surrounded us. Then what do you suggest? He looked at the body, at the symbol carved into Reed's forehead, at the smooth stones where eyes should have been. Thought about the tracks that stopped in mid-stride, the voices speaking dead languages through dying men, the sense that something vast and hungry was watching them from just beyond the edge of perception. We push forward, he said, fast and hard. Reach Fort Callahan before whatever's hunting us decides to take another member of our group. It's 3 days if we move during daylight and fortify at night. We can make it if we're smart and we're lucky. And if we're neither, then we die trying. But at least we die moving forward instead of sitting still waiting to be picked off one by one. They buried Reed in a shallow grave, all they had time for, and marked it with a cairn of stones. Sarah spoke words over the site, but they felt empty, insufficient against the weight of what they'd seen. Then they broke camp and moved out, driving the horses hard, putting distance between themselves and the killing ground. The day passed in tense silence, everyone scanning the tree line, jumping at every sound. The trail climbed steadily higher into the mountains, the air growing thin and cold, patches of old snow appearing in the shadows where sunlight never reached. They passed abandoned cabins, homesteads left empty with doors hanging open and meals still on tables, as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-bite. This whole stretch is cursed, Mary Dennison whispered. Has been for months. People keep disappearing. The ones who don't disappear start acting strange, talking to things that aren't there, seeing faces in the dark. Eventually they wander off into the wilderness and never come back. Plague can do that, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Fever breaks the mind, makes people see things. This isn't fever, Delia's voice cut through the speculation like a blade. This is something worse, something deliberate. As if summoned by her words, Marshal Hickman began to scream. The sound was inhuman, a shriek of pure agony that set every horse to rearing and sent the group scrambling for weapons. Hickman thrashed in the wagon bed, his body seizing, foam flecking his lips, but his eyes were open and aware and filled with a terror no dying man should have to bear. Make it stop, he begged, his voice raw. Please, for the love of mercy, make it stop. It's inside me. I can feel it moving, crawling through my veins, eating me from the inside out. Sarah tried to calm him, but he lashed out with surprising strength, catching her across the face and sending her tumbling from the wagon. Silas and Corbin moved in, trying to restrain the thrashing marshal, but it took 4 men to hold him down. What's inside you? Silas demanded, pinning the old lawman's shoulders. What do you feel? The hunger, Hickman gasped. The ancient hunger. It's been sleeping so long, buried so deep, but someone woke it. Someone took what was never theirs to take, and now it's free, and it's so hungry. His eyes rolled back in his head and his body went rigid, every muscle locking tight. For a terrible moment, Silas thought he was watching a man die. But then Hickman's eyes snapped open again, only now they weren't Hickman's eyes at all. They were black from edge to edge, reflecting no light, swallowing everything like twin voids in his skull. When he spoke again, it was in that same layered voice they'd heard the night before, multiple tones woven into words that hurt to hear. The sleeper wakes. The stolen sacred returns or blood pays the debt. 7 days from the theft, 6 remain. Choose wisely, thieves of the mountain. Then Hickman screamed one more time and went completely still. This time, when Sarah pressed her ear to his chest, she looked up with tears streaming down her face. "He's gone," she whispered. "The marshal's dead." They buried him there on the trail, with even less ceremony than they'd given Reed. There was no time for proper mourning, no luxury of grief. They had to keep moving. As they loaded back into the wagon and prepared to continue, Silas noticed Delia standing apart from the group, staring up at the mountains rising ahead. Her expression was troubled, distant, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. "What is it?" he asked, approaching her. 7 days from the theft," she said quietly. That's what it said. Someone stole something sacred 6 days ago, something important enough to wake whatever's hunting us. You have any idea what that might be? She was quiet for a long moment, then, "When I was with Jack's gang, there was a man who rode with us sometimes. Boone Mercer's second in command. Mean bastard named Pike Garrett. He used to talk about finding treasure in the old places, sacred grounds that nobody protected anymore. Said there was gold and silver just waiting to be taken if a man had the stones to ignore the warnings. You think someone robbed a burial site? I think someone took something they shouldn't have, and now we're all paying the price." She turned to face him, and the fear in her eyes was genuine. "Deputy, whatever's hunting us, it won't stop until it gets what it wants. Until the stolen item is returned, or until we're all dead. Those are the only 2 ways this ends. Then we find whoever took it and make them give it back. And if the thief is Boone Mercer, if he's the one who disturbed the sacred ground?" Silas felt the weight of his badge, the responsibility it carried, the promise he'd made to uphold the law and protect the innocent. But out here, in the high country where civilization was just a word and survival was the only law that mattered, those promises felt hollow. "Then we find Boone Mercer," he said, "and we make him understand that some debts have to be paid." They rode on into the gathering darkness, the mountains rising around them like the walls of a tomb slowly closing, and somewhere in the shadows between the trees something ancient and hungry watched them pass and waited for night to fall. The second grave they dug that day went deeper than the first, carved into frozen earth that fought them for every inch. Marshal Hickman deserved better than a shallow scrape in the dirt, but the mountains didn't care what anyone deserved. Silas drove the shovel into the ground one last time, his shoulders burning with effort, and stepped back to let Thomas Pruitt and James Corbin finish the work. Delia stood apart from the burial, her attention fixed on the tree line where the shadows had grown long and predatory in the fading light. She held the borrowed rifle with easy familiarity, her finger resting alongside the trigger guard in a way that told Silas she'd learned to shoot from someone who knew what they were doing. "We need to move," she said without turning. "Another hour, and we'll be digging in the dark." "Show some respect," Sarah Pruitt snapped, her voice raw from crying. "A man just died, and 6 more will die if we're still on this trail after sunset." Delia finally looked at them, her expression harder than stone. "Whatever's hunting us owns the darkness. We've seen that twice now, so unless you want to join the marshal in the ground, I suggest we get moving while we still can." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but her husband put a hand on her arm. "She's right," Thomas said quietly. "We've already lingered too long." They finished the burial in grim silence, marking the grave with a cross made from broken pine branches. No one spoke words over the body this time. There was nothing left to say that the mountains hadn't already answered with blood and terror. The trail wound higher into country that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of nature. Trees grew at impossible angles, their roots gripping stone faces where no soil should sustain life. The air tasted of copper and old snow, and every shadow seemed to hold shapes that weren't quite there when you looked directly at them. Twice Silas caught movement in his peripheral vision, but when he turned to face it, he found only empty forest and the whisper of wind through dead branches. They made camp that evening in a natural hollow surrounded by granite outcroppings that offered some protection from the wind and a clear view of the approaches. The fire they built was larger than necessary, fed with deadwood until flames reached toward the darkening sky like desperate hands seeking heaven. "We're burning through our wood supply too fast," James Corbin observed, but he made no move to bank the fire. None of them could bear the thought of darkness creeping too close. Mary Dennison and Sarah worked together preparing what passed for a meal: hardtack and dried meat, coffee so strong it could strip paint. The food tasted like ash in Silas's mouth, but he forced it down anyway. A man needed strength to fight, and he had a feeling they'd be fighting soon. "Deputy," Delia approached from where she'd been checking the horses, her expression troubled. "The animals are nervous, more than they should be from the day's travel. They keep looking toward the North Pass, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring like they're scenting something we can't. Could be a storm coming in. Could be." But her tone said she didn't believe it any more than he did. They posted double watches that night, 4 men on alert at all times, positioned at the cardinal points around their camp. Silas took the first shift with Corbin, Thomas, and a man named Robert Chen, who'd been traveling with the group since Fort Granger and said little but missed nothing with his sharp, dark eyes. The hours crawled past. Midnight came and went, marked only by the slow wheel of stars overhead and the occasional crack of the fire consuming another piece of wood. Then just after 2 in the morning, Chen raised his hand in a signal that froze everyone in place. "Movement," he whispered, barely audible over the wind. "North Pass. Multiple contacts." Silas strained his eyes against the darkness, but saw nothing except stone and shadow. Then, as his vision adjusted, he caught it, shapes moving through the rocks, man-size but wrong somehow, their gait too fluid, too purposeful, like wolves stalking prey. "How many?" he asked. 6, maybe 7. "Hard to tell. They're staying in the shadows, using the terrain for cover." Chen's voice was professional, controlled. "They're good. Whoever they are, they know what they're doing. Could be survivors from one of the homesteads. Survivors don't move like that. That's a flanking maneuver. They're surrounding us." Silas made a decision. "Wake everyone quietly. Get weapons ready, but keep them low. I don't want to start a fight if this is just travelers passing through." But even as he said it, he knew better. Nothing about this felt like chance. The camp came alive with silent, controlled movement. Sarah and Mary gathered close to the wagon, pistols in hand. Delia took position on Silas's left, her rifle trained on the North Pass, her breathing slow and steady. The remaining men spread out to cover the other approaches, creating a defensive perimeter around the fire. They waited. The shapes in the darkness drew closer, resolving into human silhouettes that moved with predatory confidence through terrain that should have slowed anyone down. When they finally stepped into the firelight, Silas felt his blood turn to ice water. There were 7 of them, hard men dressed in trail-worn clothes and carrying weapons like extensions of their own bodies. But it was the man in the lead who commanded attention, tall and lean as a whip, with eyes the color of dirty ice and a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, like someone had tried and failed to split his head in half. "Well, well," the scarred man said, his voice carrying the kind of lazy menace that came from knowing you held all the power in a situation. "Looks like we've stumbled onto a regular frontier social gathering. Mind if we join you?" "State your business," Silas said, his hand resting on his pistol grip. "You're approaching an armed camp in the middle of the night. That's a good way to get shot." The scarred man smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. "Name's Pike Garrett. These are my associates. We're looking for something that belongs to our employer. Something small, female, and answers to the name Delia Cross." Every gun in camp swung toward the newcomers. Silas stepped forward, placing himself between Garrett and Delia. "Mrs. Cross is my prisoner, being transported to Fort Callahan to stand trial. You have no claim on her." "I think you'll find our claim supersedes yours, Deputy." Garrett's smile widened. "See, Mrs. Cross possesses information that could prove inconvenient to certain business interests in the territory. My employer would very much like to have a conversation with her about what she knows and who she might have told. Your employer can file a petition with the territorial court like everyone else." "Oh, I don't think the courts are going to be relevant much longer." Garrett's gaze swept across the camp, taking in the reduced numbers, the fear barely hidden behind determined expressions. "Looks like you've had some trouble on the trail. Lost a few people, maybe? Strange things happening in the dark?" No one answered, but the silence was confirmation enough. "That's what happens when you travel through cursed country," Garrett continued, his tone conversational. "When you ignore the warnings and push forward anyway. The mountain doesn't forgive trespassers, doesn't forgive thieves, and it sure as hell doesn't forgive those who disturb what should stay buried." "You know something about what's hunting us," Delia said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You know what's out there in the dark?" Garrett's smile faded, replaced by something that might have been genuine fear. "I know enough to keep moving and not look back. I know enough to understand that some debts get paid in blood and terror. And I know that whatever's following you folks is going to catch up real soon unless you start making smarter choices. Like handing over my prisoner? Like recognizing when you're in over your head, Deputy." Garrett took a step closer, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. "My employer is willing to offer you safe passage out of these mountains, protection from what's hunting you. All you have to do is walk away and let us handle the crosswoman. Simple transaction. Everyone walks away breathing. Except Delia." "Well," Garrett shrugged, "can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs." The tension in the camp had reached the breaking point. Fingers tightened on triggers. Breathing became shallow and controlled. One wrong move, and the mountainside would erupt in gunfire. It was Delia who broke the standoff. "Your employer is Boone Mercer," she said, stepping out from behind Silas, despite his hissed warning. "And Boone's in trouble. Deep trouble. Because he took something from a sacred burial site, didn't he? Something he thought would make him rich. Something that woke up what should have stayed sleeping." Garrett's expression flickered, just for a moment, but long enough for Silas to see the truth written there. "You don't know what you're talking about," Garrett said, but his voice had lost its lazy confidence. "I know exactly what I'm talking about." Delia moved closer to the fire, her face illuminated by dancing flames. 6 days ago, Boone and your boys raided a burial ground up on the high ridge, took a death totem, probably jade or carved stone, something ancient and valuable. Figured you'd sell it to some collector back east, make enough money to retire on. But the moment you took it from that sacred ground, you unleashed something that's been hunting everyone who was part of that raid. That's why you're here, isn't it? Not just for me. You're running from the same thing we are. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "She's lying," one of Garrett's men said, but his voice shook. "No," Garrett said slowly. "No, she's not." He looked at Delia with something approaching respect. "How did you know?" "My husband talked about you and Boone, about the kind of men you were, the kind who do anything for money, including robbing the dead. And when the marshal started speaking in the old tongue, talking about stolen sacred items and blood debts, it wasn't hard to put the pieces together." She paused, studying Garrett's face. "Where's Boone now?" "Dead, 3 days ago. We found him in his tent with his throat torn out and his eyes missing. Whatever killed him arranged his body like some kind of offering, carved symbols into his flesh that none of us recognized." Garrett's hand trembled slightly as he wiped it across his scarred face. "We burned the tent with him in it and ran. Been running ever since. But the thing keeps finding us. Picked off 2 more men yesterday. We heard your camp from a mile away and figured maybe there was safety in numbers." "There's no safety," Delia said flatly, "not until the totem is returned to where it belongs." "That's a problem," Garrett laughed, but it was the sound of a man on the edge of breaking. "Because we don't have it anymore. When Boone died, the totem disappeared. We searched his body, his tent, the entire camp. It was just gone. Like whatever killed him took it back." Silas felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting, forming a picture he didn't want to see. If the spirit has the totem back, why is it still hunting us? "Because the dead isn't just about the object," a new voice said. Everyone turned to see an old man emerging from the darkness beyond the camp perimeter. He was small and weathered, his skin the color of burnished copper, his hair silver white and falling past his shoulders. He wore traditional buckskins and carried no weapons. But something about his presence made every armed man in camp feel inadequate. "Who the hell are you?" Garrett demanded. "I am Joseph Brokenwing," the old man said, his voice carrying the weight of years and knowledge. I am the keeper of the sacred sites in these mountains, the one who warned your employer not to disturb what was buried, the one he ignored. He moved into the firelight with the unhurried grace of someone who had walked these mountains for longer than most of the people present had been alive. His eyes, dark and clear as mountain pools, swept across the assembled group, seeing more than faces, reading stories written in posture and expression. The entity you awakened is called the Wendigo by some tribes, he continued. Other names exist: the hunger that walks, the empty one, the flesh that once was man. It was bound centuries ago by my ancestors, sealed in that burial ground with sacred totems and the bones of the warriors who gave their lives to trap it. The totem your employer stole was the final seal, the keystone. Without it, the binding failed. So put it back, Silas said. Reseal the binding. End this. It's not that simple, Deputy. The Wendigo is not merely spirit. It is rage and hunger given form, a corruption that spreads through blood and violence. Each person it kills, each body it defiles, becomes a vessel through which it can manifest. The totem can be replaced, yes, but only by those who carry the blood debt, only by those who participated in the theft. Garrett went pale. We didn't know. Ignorance is not innocence. Joseph's voice remained calm, but his words cut like winter wind. You knew you were stealing from a burial ground. You knew you were violating sacred space. The spirits care nothing for your excuses. They care only for balance restored. So what do we do? This from Sarah Pruitt, her voice small and frightened. We didn't steal anything. We're just trying to survive. You travel with the thieves, Joseph said, gesturing toward Garrett and his men. In the eyes of the Wendigo, that makes you complicit. The corruption spreads not just through those who committed the crime, but through those who offer them shelter, aid, or companionship. You should have turned them away when they approached your camp. Now you are all marked. The implications of his words settled over the camp like a funeral shroud. Thomas Pruitt pulled his wife close. Mary Dennison began to cry quietly. Even hardened men like Corbin and Chen looked shaken. There has to be a way to fight this, Silas said. Some way to survive. There is one path. Joseph moved to the fire, reaching into a pouch at his belt and withdrawing a handful of herbs that he scattered into the flames. The fire flared green for a moment, and a sharp, clean scent filled the air. Sage and sweetgrass, and something else Silas couldn't identify. You must return to the burial ground. You must take the remaining thieves and offer them in atonement. The Wendigo will accept their lives as payment for the violation. Then, and only then, can new wards be placed and the binding restored. You're talking about human sacrifice, Silas said. I am talking about justice. Joseph met his gaze without flinching. 7 men participated in the theft. 1 is dead, 6 remain. The debt requires 6 lives. Whether you offer them willingly or the Wendigo takes them in violence, the debt will be paid. Garrett and his men began backing toward the edge of camp, hands moving toward weapons. Like hell, Garrett snarled. We're not dying for some spirit's sense of cosmic balance. Then you will die running, Joseph said simply. The Wendigo will hunt you until you are nothing but meat and memory. It will wear your faces, speak with your voices, use your bodies to kill those you once called friends. There is no escape. There is only the choice of how you meet your end with dignity and purpose, or in terror and corruption. The standoff shattered as one of Garrett's men broke, turning to run into the darkness. He made it maybe 10 feet before something massive and terrible emerged from the shadows and took him off his feet. The scream that followed would haunt Silas's nightmares for whatever remained of his life, a shriek of pure agony that ended in a wet, tearing sound. Chaos erupted. Garrett's men scattered, firing blindly into the darkness. The camp survivors scrambled for weapons, forming a defensive circle around the fire. Silas caught a glimpse of what had taken the running man, something that moved on 2 legs but bent wrong at the joints, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones that jutted at unnatural angles, its face a nightmare of too many teeth and eyes that gleamed black in the firelight. Stay together, he shouted, firing his rifle at the creature. The bullet struck home, punching through its shoulder, but it barely slowed. The thing's head swiveled toward him, and he saw its mouth open impossibly wide, revealing a throat lined with additional teeth that spiraled down into darkness. Then Delia was beside him, her rifle barking twice in rapid succession. Her shots took the creature in the head, and this time it went down, thrashing and screaming in that layered voice they'd heard from Hickman's dying throat. "Silver!" Joseph called out over the gunfire. "You need silver to kill what it has already claimed. Lead will only slow it down." "We don't have silver bullets," Corbin shouted back, still firing at shapes moving through the darkness. "Then you must survive until dawn. The Wendigo's power weakens in daylight. Run if you must, but stay together. Separation means death." The creature Delia had shot was already starting to move again, its shattered head reforming, bones knitting back together with sounds like wet branches breaking. Silas grabbed her arm. "Fall back to the wagon. Everyone tighten the circle. Fire and steel. Keep it between us and them." They retreated in controlled chaos, maintaining formation through sheer force of will and fear. The creatures in the darkness, 3 of them now, maybe 4, circled the camp like wolves testing a defensive herd. Every time one charged, it was met with concentrated gunfire that knocked it back but never kept it down for long. "How long until dawn?" Sarah gasped, reloading her pistol with shaking hands. Silas checked the stars, did the calculation. 3 hours, maybe 4. "We'll never make it. We don't have enough ammunition for 4 hours." She was right. They'd burned through half their supplies already, and the creatures showed no signs of slowing. If anything, they were getting bolder, testing the defensive perimeter with increasing frequency. It was Joseph who offered the only option that might keep them alive. "There is a place," he said, his voice carrying despite the noise and chaos. "A shelter built by my ancestors for exactly this purpose. A stone lodge 1/2 mile north, warded with protections the Wendigo cannot easily cross. If you can reach it, you can survive the night. 1/2 mile through territory controlled by those things?" Garrett had lost his earlier arrogance, his scarred face slick with sweat and fear. "That's suicide." "Staying here is suicide," Joseph countered. "The creatures will wear you down, and when your ammunition runs dry, they will tear you apart. The lodge offers the only chance." Silas made the call. "We run. Tight formation. Fastest at the center, strongest on the flanks. Anyone falls, we don't stop. Understood?" Grim nods all around. No one liked it, but no one had a better option. They broke for the North Pass in a controlled sprint, abandoning the fire and most of their supplies, carrying only weapons and desperate hope. The creatures pursued immediately, their hunting cries echoing off the stone faces, a sound like nothing human mixed with everything terrible. Thomas Pruitt went down first, his ankle turning on loose stone. He hit the ground hard, and before anyone could react, one of the creatures was on him, bearing him down into darkness. His screams followed them as they ran, cutting off abruptly in a way that meant finality. Sarah was screaming her husband's name, fighting against Corbin's grip as he dragged her forward. Mary stumbled but caught herself, pure terror giving her speed she didn't know she possessed. The trail climbed, steep and treacherous, testing legs already exhausted from days of hard travel. Silas could feel his lungs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. Behind them, the creatures gained ground, their unnatural speed making mockery of human endurance. Then, emerging from the darkness ahead, Silas saw it. A structure of stacked stone covered in symbols carved deep into the rock faces. It was ancient, far older than any settlement in the territory, built by hands that understood things the modern world had forgotten. "There!" Joseph pointed. "Inside, quickly!" They poured through the entrance, a low opening barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside. A circular chamber maybe 20 feet across with a smoke hole in the center of the roof and more symbols covering every available surface. The last person through was Robert Chen, and he was no longer alone. One of the creatures had caught up, its twisted hand gripping his ankle, pulling him backward into the darkness. Chen screamed, his fingers scrabbling for purchase on the stone floor. Delia didn't hesitate. She grabbed Chen's outstretched hand with one of hers and drove her knife into the creature's wrist with the other. Black blood sprayed across the stone, and the thing shrieked and released its grip. Chen scrambled inside, and Silas and Corbin together dragged a massive stone across the entrance, sealing them in. The creatures threw themselves against the stone, their impact shaking dust from the ceiling, but the barrier held, and after several minutes the attack ceased. Why did they stop? Sarah whispered, her face buried against Mary's shoulder. The wards, Joseph said, moving around the chamber and touching symbols with his fingers, speaking words in a language that predated English. They prevent the corrupted from entering this space. We are safe here, for now. For how long? Garrett demanded. Until dawn. After that, we must move quickly toward the burial ground. The Wendigo will be weaker in daylight, but it will not stop hunting. And with each person it takes, it grows stronger. They collapsed against the stone walls, catching their breath, taking stock of who remained. The group that had numbered 14 just hours ago was now down to 9. Silas, Delia, Sarah Pruitt, Mary Dennison, James Corbin, Robert Chen, Joseph Brokenwing, and 2 of Garrett's men, including Garrett himself. Too many dead. Too many lost to something that shouldn't exist outside nightmares and old stories. Tell us everything, Silas said to Joseph. No more mysteries. No more half-truths. If we're going to survive this, we need to know exactly what we're fighting. The old man settled cross-legged on the stone floor, his weathered face grave in the dim light that filtered through the smoke hole above. And as the creatures prowled and screamed in the darkness outside, he began to speak. Joseph's voice filled the stone chamber with the weight of centuries, each word deliberate and heavy as winter snow accumulating on dead branches. The first Wendigo was not born of darkness, he began, his eyes distant, seen through time to something older than the stones around them. It was born of desperation, of hunger so profound that a man chose to cross the line that separates human from monster. Outside, the creatures continued their prowling, their footsteps scraping against rock, their breathing wet and labored. But inside the warded lodge, the survivors listened with the absolute attention of people whose lives depended on understanding. In the time before the trappers came, before the forts and the settlements, a terrible winter descended on my people. The snow fell for 3 moons without ceasing. Game disappeared. The rivers froze solid. Families began to starve. Joseph's fingers traced the symbols carved into the wall beside him, following patterns that hurt to look at directly. One man, a warrior named He Who Walks Far, watched his children waste away, watched his wife grow hollow-eyed and silent. And when the choice came between watching them die or doing the unthinkable, he chose survival at any cost. He ate human flesh, Delia said quietly. It wasn't a question. He consumed his own dead, Joseph confirmed. And in that consumption he invited something ancient and terrible to inhabit his body. The Wendigo is not merely a spirit, it is a transformation. A corruption that occurs when a human being violates the most sacred law of nature. Once the change begins, it cannot be stopped. The person you were is, and what remains is hunger, endless, insatiable hunger that can never be satisfied because it is spiritual as much as physical. Silas felt his skin crawl. So the things hunting us, they were people once? Some of them. The Wendigo can spread its corruption through bite or through blood. Each new victim becomes another vessel, another body through which the hunger can manifest. He Who Walks Far killed and consumed half his tribe before the warriors managed to trap him. They built this lodge, performed the binding ritual, and sealed him in a sacred burial ground half a day's journey north of here. That was nearly 200 years ago. But your people kept watch, Mary Dennison said, her voice steadier than it had been since Thomas died. You maintained the wards, kept the binding strong. For generations, yes. My grandfather's grandfather tended the sacred sites, then my grandfather, then my father, and now me. Joseph's expression darkened. But the world changed. The treaties came and pushed our people onto smaller and smaller parcels of land. The old ways were forbidden, the ceremonies outlawed. I am the last keeper. When I die, the knowledge dies with me. Already some of the binding sites have fallen into disrepair. The wards grow weak. And then Boone Mercer came along and kicked the door wide open, Garrett said bitterly. He sat slumped against the wall, his earlier bravado completely gone. We thought it was just another burial mound. Figured there might be jade or turquoise, maybe some old silverwork we could sell. Boone said the old stories were just superstition meant to keep white men away from Indian treasure. The stories are all that kept the Wendigo contained, Joseph said, his voice carrying a note of anger for the first time. The fear, the respect, the understanding that some places must be left undisturbed. Your employer ignored all of that, and now the corruption spreads faster than it has in 2 centuries. Robert Chen spoke up, his analytical mind working through the implications. You said 6 men participated in the theft. 1 is dead. That leaves 5 who carry the blood debt. But there are only 2 here. He gestured at Garrett and the other surviving gang member, a rail-thin man named Dutch who hadn't spoken since they'd entered the lodge. Where are the other 3? Dead or transformed by now, Joseph said. The Wendigo takes the thieves first, uses them as vessels because their corruption makes them vulnerable. By now, at least some of your companions have become what hunts us. Dutch made a choking sound and lurched to his feet. I'm not sitting here waiting to turn into one of those things. I'm not... He lunged for the stone blocking the entrance. Garrett caught him, wrestling him back. Don't be a fool. You go out there, you're dead in seconds. Better dead than what we saw out there. Better a bullet than becoming that. No one's becoming anything if we move smart and move fast, Silas said, his voice cutting through the rising panic. Joseph, you said the binding can be restored. Tell us how. The old man was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from face to face, measuring the strength he saw there. The original binding required the willing sacrifice of 7 warriors. Their deaths empowered the wards and sealed the Wendigo in the burial ground. To restore the binding now, we need the blood of those who broke it. All 6 remaining thieves must return to the sacred ground and offer themselves. Their deaths will close the wound they opened. Human sacrifice, Sarah whispered, horror written across her features. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about justice, about balance. The natural order was violated. It must be restored. Joseph's voice was implacable. This is not negotiable. This is not subject to your modern laws or your moral judgments. This is the reality of the forces you have awakened. 6 lives to save how many others? 6 lives to prevent the Wendigo from spreading beyond these mountains into the settlements, the towns, the cities beyond. How many will die if we fail? Silas felt the weight of his badge like an anchor dragging him down. Everything in his training, every oath he'd taken, rebelled against the idea of leading men to their deaths. But he'd also seen what was hunting them, seen the twisted bodies, the empty eyes, the hunger that could never be satisfied. There has to be another way, he said, but even he could hear the doubt in his own voice. There is no other way. Delia's voice was quiet but firm. She met Silas's gaze across the chamber, her storm-gray eyes steady. I've been listening to men say, there has to be another way my whole life, usually right before they do the thing they swore they'd never do. We can waste time pretending we have choices, or we can accept reality and figure out how to survive it. You're talking about marching men to their deaths. I'm talking about stopping something that will kill hundreds if we don't act. She stood, moving closer to the entrance where the sounds of prowling creatures continued. My husband rode with Boone Mercer for 3 years. I know the kind of man Boone was. I know the kind of men who followed him. They've left a trail of bodies across this territory. Homesteaders murdered for their land, traders robbed and killed, women violated and discarded. If their deaths can prevent more innocent people from dying, then that's not murder. That's justice. The law is 100 miles away, deputy, and it doesn't have teeth sharp enough to fight what's out there. She turned back to face him. You want to hold on to your badge and your principles? Fine, but don't ask the rest of us to die for your conscience. The words hit like physical blows. Silas wanted to argue, to defend the system he'd sworn to uphold, but the bodies he'd buried over the past 3 days spoke louder than any legal argument. James Corbin cleared his throat. The lady's got a point. We're well past the point where normal rules apply. Question is, how do we get the thieves to the burial ground? Because I'm guessing they won't go willingly. All eyes turned to Garrett and Dutch. The scarred man's face was unreadable, but Dutch had gone pale, his hands trembling violently. You're actually considering this, Dutch said, his voice rising. You're actually talking about killing us like we're livestock to be slaughtered. You robbed a grave, Mary said, her voice hard. You woke something that's already killed 6 people that we know of, probably more. You did this. The least you can do is help fix it. I didn't know. We didn't know what would happen. But you knew it was sacred ground, Joseph said. You knew you were violating the dead. You chose to proceed anyway, and now you must pay the price for that choice. Dutch's hand dropped to his pistol. I'm not dying for some spirit's idea of cosmic balance. I'm not... The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Dutch's body hit the stone floor, blood spreading from the neat hole in the center of his forehead. Garrett stood over him, his pistol still smoking, his expression carved from stone. "One down," he said quietly. 5 to go. Sarah screamed. Mary gasped and turned away. Even Silas, who'd seen his share of violence, felt shock ripple through him at the casual brutality of the execution. "What the hell did you just do?" he demanded, his own weapon coming up. What needed doing? Garrett holstered his pistol and met Silas's gaze without flinching. Dutch was about to start shooting, and in here that would have killed us all. Besides, he was dead anyway. This way was cleaner, faster, more human than what's waiting outside. "You murdered him." "I gave him mercy." Garrett's voice was flat, emotionless. "And I'll do the same for the others when the time comes. But first, we need to survive until dawn and make it to that burial ground. So you can either arrest me, deputy, or you can accept that we're in a situation where the old rules don't apply anymore." Silas felt the moment crystallize around him, sharp and clear as breaking ice. He could enforce the law, uphold justice as he understood it, and probably get everyone killed in the process. Or he could accept that they'd crossed into territory where survival trumped principle, where the choice between right and wrong had been replaced by the choice between terrible and worse. He lowered his weapon. "We move at first light. Stay together, stay armed, and don't trust anything that moves. Joseph, you'll guide us to the burial ground." The old man nodded. "The path is treacherous, but I know it well. If we move quickly and the Wendigo doesn't harry us too severely, we can reach it by midday." "And the other thieves?" Chen asked. "The ones who aren't here?" "They'll come." Joseph's voice was certain. "The Wendigo will drive them toward the burial ground, whether they want to go or not. The corruption pulls them back to the source. They'll be there, willing or not." They settled in to wait for dawn, taking turns at watch, even though the wards seemed to be holding. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness, measured by the sounds of the creatures outside and the ragged breathing of people too traumatized to sleep. Silas found himself sitting near Delia, the two of them sharing the kind of silence that comes from shared survival rather than comfort. She'd cleaned and reloaded her weapons with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and sure. "You were right," he said finally, "about the law not having teeth for this." "I'm usually right about things," she replied, a ghost of dark humor in her voice. "My husband used to say it was my most annoying quality. You loved him, despite what he was. I loved who he tried to be, the man he wanted to become before Boone and the others pulled him back into the darkness." She was quiet for a moment. "Jack wasn't a good man. I knew that when I married him, but he was trying to be better. That has to count for something." "Does it?" "I don't know anymore. Maybe trying isn't enough. Maybe the world only cares about what you do, not what you intend." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the dim light. "What about you, deputy? Are you a good man?" "I try to be." That's not an answer. He considered the question seriously. "I enforce the law because I believe in order, in civilization, in the idea that we're better than animals, that we can build something lasting and just. But out here," he gestured at the stone walls, the symbols, the corpse growing cold on the floor. "Out here, I'm not sure any of that matters." "It matters," Delia said firmly. "Maybe not today, maybe not in this moment, but it matters. The fact that you're struggling with this, that you're not comfortable with what needs to be done, that's what separates you from men like Boone Mercer. He never questioned, never doubted, just took what he wanted and damned the consequences. And look where that got him." "Exactly." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Sometimes the monsters get what they deserve, and sometimes the rest of us just have to clean up the mess they left behind." Dawn came slowly, light seeping through the smoke hole like blood from a wound. When the sun finally crested the eastern peaks, Joseph stood and began removing the wards, speaking words in the old tongue that made the carved symbols pulse with faint light before going dark. "Stay close," he said, as Garrett and Corbin wrestled the stone away from the entrance. "Stay armed and stay alert. The Wendigo's power diminishes in daylight, but it does not disappear. It will still hunt, still kill, just more cautiously." They emerged into a world transformed by horror. The ground around the lodge was torn up as if by massive claws, trees shredded to splinters, and in several places the earth itself seemed to have been scorched black, despite there being no evidence of fire. And there were bodies. What remained of them, anyway? Garrett's men who'd fled the first attack, scattered across the mountainside in pieces that barely resembled anything human. "Don't look," Silas said to Sarah, who'd gone pale as milk. "Keep your eyes forward and keep moving." Joseph led them north along a trail so faint Silas would have missed it if he'd been alone. The old man moved with surprising speed for his age, his feet finding purchase on loose scree that threatened to send the others tumbling down the mountain. They'd been climbing for maybe an hour when they heard the gunfire. It came from higher up the mountain, the crack of rifles echoing off stone faces. Whoever was shooting was doing so with desperate intensity, pouring fire into something that didn't seem to care. "The other thieves," Joseph said. "The Wendigo has found them." "We need to help them," Silas said, already adjusting his course toward the sound. "Why?" Garrett's voice was harsh. "They're dead men already. Let them buy us time with their dying. Because if they die before we reach the burial ground, we can't complete the binding. We need all 6, remember?" Silas didn't wait for agreement, just broke into a run toward the gunfire. The others followed, strung out in a ragged line as the terrain grew steeper and more treacherous. The shooting intensified, then cut off abruptly in a chorus of screams that spoke of agony and terror beyond comprehension. They found the thieves in a narrow defile between 2 rock faces, pinned down by 3 of the transformed creatures that had once been men. The Wendigo's victims moved with terrifying speed and power. Their bodies twisted into forms that violated every natural law, their faces stretched into masks of eternal hunger. 2 of the thieves were already down, their bodies torn open and their blood painting the stones. The third, a heavy-set man with a thick beard, had his back against a rock wall, firing his pistol with shaking hands at a creature that stalked toward him with predatory patience. Silas didn't hesitate. He brought his rifle up and fired, the bullet catching the creature in the back and spinning it around. It shrieked in that layered voice that seemed to come from multiple throats, then charged directly at him with speed that should have been impossible. Delia and Corbin fired together, their shots staggering the creature but not dropping it. Chen flanked left and emptied his rifle into its side, and finally it went down, thrashing and screaming but no longer advancing. The other 2 creatures turned their attention to the new threat. One of them had been human recently enough that Silas could still see the face beneath the corruption, a young man, maybe 20, with terror frozen in eyes that had gone completely black. "That's Billy Crane," Garrett said, his voice tight. "He rode with us. He was on the burial ground when we took the totem." "Then he's already lost," Joseph said. "The transformation is complete. There's nothing human left." But Billy's mouth was moving, forming words that came out garbled and wet. "Help me, please. It hurts. So hungry. Can't stop." Sarah made a broken sound. "He's still in there, still aware." "The worst part of the curse," Joseph said quietly. "The person you were doesn't die immediately. It's trapped inside, watching as the corruption uses your body to commit atrocities. Eventually, the human consciousness fades completely, but in the early stages, they're fully aware." Billy lunged forward, and this time Silas was ready. He fired 3 times, controlled shots to center mass, and Billy went down hard. But even as he fell, the wounds were already beginning to close, black blood congealing into scabs that hardened like armor. "We can't kill them," Chen shouted, backing away as the third creature circled around, looking for an opening. "We don't need to kill them," Joseph said. "We just need to contain them until we reach the burial ground. There, the binding can be restored, and their suffering will end." The creature that had been stalking Chen suddenly changed targets, its black eyes fixing on Garrett with terrible recognition. When it spoke, the voice was layered, but one tone stood out above the others, familiar, haunted. "You did this. Pike. You convinced us. Said it was safe. Said we'd be rich." Garrett's face went white. "Samson? Sam, is that you? What's left of me?" The creature took a step forward, its movements jerky and uncontrolled, as if something else was fighting for dominance inside its skin. "Kill me, please, before it takes everything, before I... Its body convulsed, and when it straightened, the human voice was gone, replaced by the pure hunger of the Wendigo. It charged, Garrett stood his ground and fired every round in his pistol directly into the thing that had been his friend. The impacts drove it backward, but didn't stop it. When his gun clicked empty, he dropped it and drew his knife, his face set in grim acceptance. Delia tackled him sideways just as the creature's claws swept through the space where he'd been standing. They rolled together across the rocky ground, coming up in a tangle of limbs while the creature wheeled around for another attack. Silas saw what needed to happen and made the call. "Corbin, Chen, nets and ropes."
"We're not killing them. We're binding them. Get them restrained and we drag them to the burial ground." It was chaos. Pure, desperate chaos as they fought to subdue creatures that had strength and speed beyond anything human. Chen took a slash across his arm that opened him to the bone, but he kept fighting. Mary Dennison, who'd never held anything more dangerous than a kitchen knife, somehow got a rope around Billy Crane's neck and held on while Corbin secured his arms. The creature that had been Samson proved harder. It fought with animal cunning, using the terrain to its advantage, targeting the weakest members of the group. It nearly got Sarah before Garrett threw himself bodily at the thing, bearing it down to the ground and holding it while the others secured it. When the fighting finally stopped, they had 3 transformed Wendigo victims bound with rope and the surviving thief, the bearded man, cowering against the rock wall in a state of near catatonic terror. "That's 4 of the 6, Joseph said, taking stock of their situation. "The debt requires 6 lives. We still need 2 more. "The bodies," the bearded man gasped, pointing at his fallen companions. "Tommy and Jack, they were thieves too. They're right there." Joseph examined the corpses, his expression grave. "Dead too long. The ritual requires the blood of the living. These men's spirits have already fled. They cannot serve as payment for the debt," which meant they were still 2 thieves short of what they needed to restore the binding. Garrett straightened, his face bloodied but his eyes clear. "I'm one of the 6. I was there when we took the totem. My blood carries the debt." "And the last one?" Silas asked, though he was starting to suspect the answer. "Boone Mercer was the 6th, Garrett said, "but he's dead. The Wendigo took him 3 days ago." "Then we have a problem," Joseph said quietly. "The binding requires 6. We have only 5. 3 transformed victims and 2 living thieves. Without the 6th, the ritual cannot be completed. The binding will fail." The implications settled over the group like a death sentence. They'd fought their way here, lost half their number, dragged 3 transformed monsters across impossible terrain, all for a solution that couldn't work. "There has to be a way," Silas said, but even he could hear the desperation in his voice. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face troubled. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with reluctance. "There is one possibility. The binding requires 6 lives touched by the corruption. 6 people who carry the blood debt, either through participation in the theft or through contamination by the Wendigo's curse. The 3 transformed victims qualify. Garrett qualifies. The bearded man qualifies." "That's 5, Chen said. "Yes." Joseph's eyes moved across the group, measuring, evaluating. "But there is one among us who has been touched by the corruption, who has fought the transformed ones, been splashed with their blood, breathed the same air, shared their space. The curse spreads through contact, through proximity. It is slow, but it is inexorable." Understanding hit Silas like a physical blow. "No." "The wound on Chen's arm," Joseph continued relentlessly, "inflicted by a creature's claw. The blood mingled. The corruption entered." Chen looked down at his bandaged arm, at the blood seeping through the cloth. His face went slack with horror. "You're saying I'm infected. I'm saying you carry the seed of the curse. In time, days, perhaps weeks, it will take root. You will begin the transformation, but for now you remain human enough to serve as the 6th sacrifice." "No," Silas said again, more forcefully. "We're not killing an innocent man." "He's not innocent," Joseph said, his voice gentle but firm. "None of us are. The moment we chose to travel with the thieves, to offer them aid and shelter, we became complicit in their crime. The Wendigo recognizes no distinction between thief and accomplice. We are all marked. Chen simply carries the mark most visibly." Chen was shaking, his face drained of color.
How long do I have if we don't do the ritual? Based on the depth of the wound and the amount of blood you were exposed to, 3 days, perhaps 4. You'll begin feeling the hunger soon. Thoughts you've never had before. Urges that horrify you. And then the physical changes will start, and there will be no turning back. The young man looked at his companions, at the people he'd traveled with and fought beside. And if I agree to this, if I'm the 6th sacrifice, then your death will have meaning. You will die human, die with purpose, and help seal the Wendigo back in its prison. You will save lives, perhaps hundreds of lives. But I'll still die. Yes. The silence stretched out, broken only by the wind through the rocks, and the labored breathing of the bound creatures that had once been men. It was Delia who spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. This isn't his choice to make alone. We all traveled together. We all share the responsibility. If Chen's going to sacrifice himself, the least we can do is make sure it counts. Make sure the binding holds, and this nightmare ends. Agreed, Corbin said quietly. I'm tired of running, tired of watching good people die for bad men's mistakes. If this is what it takes to make it right, then let's finish it. One by one, the others nodded. Even Sarah, still grief-stricken over Thomas's death, agreed that ending the curse was worth the terrible price. Chen took a deep breath, steadying himself. How does it work? The ritual? We bring all 6 to the burial ground, Joseph explained. The 3 transformed ones, the 2 thieves, and you. There, at the place where the original binding was made, I will perform the ceremony of restoration. Your lives will empower new wards, seal the Wendigo back in its prison, and cleanse the corruption from these mountains. And it'll hold? The binding? If done correctly, it will hold for another 2 centuries, long enough for the world to forget why it should fear these mountains, long enough for new keepers to be trained, if any remain who remember the old ways. Chen nodded slowly, his decision made. Then let's get moving. We've got a burial ground to reach and a demon to put back in its cage. They gathered their gear and their prisoners, living and transformed, and began the final leg of the journey north. The trail grew steeper, more treacherous, climbing through country that seemed to exist outside normal reality. Trees grew in impossible configurations, their branches forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. The air tasted of copper and old snow, and every shadow seemed to hide shapes that weren't quite there. It was mid-afternoon when they finally reached it, a clearing carved into the mountainside, surrounded by standing stones covered in symbols similar to those in the lodge. In the center was a raised mound of earth, perhaps 20 feet across, with a flat stone altar at its summit. This is the place, Joseph said, his voice reverent. Here, 200 years ago, 7 warriors gave their lives to bind the Wendigo. Here, we will complete the circle and restore what was broken. But as they entered the clearing, Silas felt the hair on his neck stand up. Something was wrong. The air was too still, too quiet, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Then, from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, they emerged. More of the transformed ones, at least a dozen, their bodies twisted and corrupted, their eyes black as void. And among them, walking with terrible purpose, was something that had once been Boone Mercer. He was massive now, easily 8 feet tall, his body stretched and distorted until he barely resembled anything human. His face was a nightmare of too many teeth and no longer possessed anything resembling mercy or reason. When he spoke, the voice came from everywhere at once, layered and terrible. You bring my thieves back to me. How thoughtful. I will enjoy consuming them slowly, and then I will consume you, and your children, and your children's children, until nothing remains but hunger. The creatures charged, and the clearing erupted into violence that would determine whether the corruption spread beyond these mountains or died here in blood and sacrifice and desperate hope. The clearing became a killing ground in the space between heartbeats. Silas fired without conscious thought, his rifle barking 3 times in rapid succession as the transformed creatures surged forward like a wave of corrupted flesh and impossible hunger. His bullets found their marks, punching through torsos and shattering limbs, but the creatures barely slowed, their wounds closing almost as fast as they opened. Get to the altar! Joseph's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. The wards are strongest there. Form a circle and hold them back. They ran, a desperate scramble across ground that seemed to shift beneath their feet, as if the earth itself rejected their presence. Delia hauled the bearded thief forward by his collar when he stumbled, her strength born of pure survival instinct. Corbin and Chen dragged the three bound transformed ones, their ropes cutting into hands already raw and bleeding. The thing that had been Boone Mercer moved faster than anything that size should have been able to move. It covered the distance between the tree line and the survivors in 3 massive bounds, its clawed hands reaching for Sarah Pruitt with terrible intent. She screamed and fired her pistol point blank into its chest, the muzzle flash illuminating a face that was all teeth and hunger and nothing remotely human. Garrett threw himself between Sarah and the creature, his knife flashing in the afternoon sun as he drove it into the thing's throat. Black blood sprayed across his face, burning like acid where it touched skin, but he held on, twisting the blade, buying precious seconds for Sarah to scramble backward toward the altar. "Not so tough now, are you, Boone?" Garrett snarled, his voice raw with rage and grief and the terrible satisfaction of finally striking back.
Remember what you said, that nothing in these mountains could touch you? How's that working out? The Boone thing's hand closed around Garrett's throat and lifted him off the ground like he weighed nothing. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth spiraling down into a throat that seemed to extend forever into darkness. Silas didn't hesitate. He reversed his rifle and drove the stock directly into the creature's temple with every ounce of strength he possessed. The impact shattered wood and sent the thing staggering sideways, its grip loosening enough for Garrett to tear free and fall gasping to the ground. "Move!" Silas grabbed Garrett's arm and hauled him upright, half dragging him toward the altar where the others had formed a ragged defensive circle. Behind them, the Boone thing recovered and roared, a sound that shook snow from the surrounding pines and sent birds erupting from the trees in panicked flight. They reached the altar as the creatures closed in from all sides, a tightening noose of corrupted flesh and malevolent hunger. Joseph stood at the center of the raised mound, his hands moving in complex patterns as he spoke words in the old tongue, each syllable seeming to push back against the approaching nightmare. The standing stones around the clearing began to glow with faint light, symbols carved into their surfaces pulsing in rhythm with Joseph's chanting. The creatures slowed, their advance becoming hesitant, as if they were walking into a strong wind that the survivors couldn't feel. "The wards still hold power," Joseph called out, sweat beading on his weathered face despite the cold. "But they are weak, weakened by time and neglect. They will not hold long against this many." "How long do you need for the ritual?" Silas demanded, checking his ammunition. 3 rounds left in the rifle, maybe 5 in his pistol. Not nearly enough. The ceremony takes time. The blood must be offered properly, the words spoken in sequence, the wards renewed one by one. Joseph's eyes were distant, calculating. "Half an hour. Perhaps less if the spirits are willing to accept a shortened form." "We don't have half an hour," Chen shouted, firing at a creature that had found a gap in the defensive circle. His wounded arm shook violently, blood soaking through the bandage and dripping onto the sacred ground. "We'll be overrun in minutes." "Then you must buy me minutes," Joseph said, his voice taking on a quality that transcended normal speech, resonating with power that came from somewhere ancient and deep. "You must hold this ground while I perform the binding. If you fail, if the creatures breach the altar before the ritual is complete, we all die, and the corruption spreads unchecked across the frontier." Delia moved to stand beside Silas, her rifle steady despite the terror that had to be coursing through her veins. "We hold," she said simply. "Whatever it takes, we hold." Mary Dennison, who had lost her husband to a farming accident 2 years ago, and her hope somewhere on this terrible journey, checked her pistol with hands that no longer shook. "For Thomas," she said quietly. "For Reed. For Hickman. For everyone this thing has taken. We hold." The creatures tested the wards again, and this time several managed to push through, their bodies smoking where they crossed the threshold of sacred ground. Silas fired, his bullet taking the lead creature in the eye and dropping it in a thrashing heap. Corbin and Chen concentrated their fire on another, driving it back but not killing it. Then the Boone thing charged, and this time nothing was going to stop it. It crashed through the weakened wards like they were cobwebs, its massive form absorbing punishment that would have killed a dozen normal men. Sarah fired until her gun clicked empty, then threw the useless weapon at the creature's face and grabbed for the knife at her belt. Mary stood her ground and fired with methodical precision,
each shot placed with care even as terror threatened to overwhelm reason. The creature's claws swept out, catching Mary across the chest and sending her tumbling backward. She hit the ground hard, blood spreading across her dress, her breath coming in wet, labored gasps. "No!" Sarah was on her knees beside Mary in an instant, pressing her hands against the wounds, trying desperately to stem the bleeding. "Stay with me, Mary. Stay with me. We're going to get out of this. We're going to—" "Liar," Mary whispered, blood flecking her lips. "Always were. A terrible liar, Sarah. But I love you for trying." Her eyes found Joseph, who continued his ritual even as chaos erupted around him. "Make it worth something. My death. Make it mean something." Then her eyes went glassy and still, and Sarah's scream of grief and rage echoed across the burial ground like a declaration of war against the forces of darkness themselves. Joseph's chanting intensified, his voice rising above the sounds of battle and death. He moved to where the three bound transformed ones lay struggling against their ropes, and he drew a knife carved from white stone that seemed to drink in the light. "The first offering," he intoned, and drove the knife into the heart of the creature that had been Billy Crane. Black blood fountained from the wound, but instead of spreading across the ground, it flowed toward the altar stone as if drawn by invisible channels. The symbols carved into the stone began to glow brighter, pulsing with renewed power. Billy's body convulsed once, twice, then went still. And as it did, something emerged from the corpse. A translucent shape that might have been human once, twisted and tortured, but slowly resolving back into the form of a young man. It hovered for a moment, its face showing relief and terrible sadness, then dispersed like morning mist, finally free. "The curse releases its hold on the dead," Joseph said, moving to the second transformed creature. "Each death empowers the binding. Each sacrifice strengthens the wards." But they were running out of time. More creatures poured into the clearing, drawn by the ritual's power like moths to flame. The defensive circle collapsed as the survivors were forced into tighter and tighter quarters, backs pressed together, ammunition running critically low. Chen went down when a creature's claws raked across his legs, opening them to the bone. He fell hard, his rifle clattering away across blood-slicked stone. The creature loomed over him, its jaws opening wide to finish what it had started. Garrett was there before conscious thought, his knife finding the thing's throat, sawing through corrupted flesh with desperate strength. "Not today," he snarled. "Not him. Not like this." He helped Chen to his feet, supporting the younger man's weight even as his own strength flagged. "Can you stand?" "Can I die standing?" Chen countered, pain turning his voice harsh. "Because that's what you're really asking." "Fair point." Garrett's scarred face split in a grim smile. "But let's try to postpone that as long as possible." Joseph completed the second sacrifice, and another tortured spirit found release. The wards grew stronger, pushing back against the encroaching corruption. But it wasn't enough. The Boon Thing rallied the remaining creatures for another assault, and this time Silas knew they wouldn't survive it. "Joseph!" he shouted. "We're out of time. Whatever you're going to do it now." "The ritual requires all 6, Joseph called back, his hands already moving toward the third transformed creature. 3 dead, 3 living. The balance must be maintained." The bearded thief, who had remained silent and terrified throughout the battle, suddenly lunged forward. "Take me," he screamed. "I was there. I took the cursed totem. My blood carries the debt. Just make this end, please. Just make it end." Joseph's white knife flashed, and the bearded man's throat opened in a red smile. He collapsed to his knees, his hands clutching at the wound, his eyes wide with terror and something that might have been relief. Joseph caught him as he fell, guiding him down to the altar stone where his blood joined the rest, flowing into the ancient channels carved by hands long turned to dust. 4 sacrifices, 2 more needed. "Pike Garrett," Joseph said, his voice resonating with ritual power. "Do you offer yourself freely to restore the binding?" Garrett looked at the knife, at the altar stone, at his hands stained with black blood and old crimes. "I don't want to die," he said honestly, "but I'm tired of running, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of watching people pay for my mistakes." He met Silas's eyes. "Tell them I didn't go quietly. Tell them Pike Garrett died on his feet with a knife in his hand and defiance in his heart." "I'll tell them," Silas promised, his throat tight. Garrett walked to Joseph with steady steps, his scarred face calm. "Make it quick." The white knife found his heart with practiced precision. Garrett's legs buckled, but he remained upright through sheer force of will, his eyes finding the boon thing one last time. "See you in hell, boss," he whispered, then fell. 5 sacrifices. 1 more needed. 1. The wards blazed with power now, forcing the creatures back, creating a barrier between the altar and the approaching nightmare. But the boon thing was stronger than the others, ancient and terrible, and it pushed through the barrier with brute force and malevolent will. Chen tried to step forward, to offer himself as the final sacrifice, but his ruined legs gave out and he collapsed. Delia caught him, lowering him gently to the ground. "I'm supposed to be the 6th, Chen gasped. "The corruption, I'm infected. It has to be me." "The infection hasn't taken hold yet," Joseph said, his expression troubled. "Your blood is tainted but not transformed. It might be enough, or it might fail, and the binding will collapse before completion." The boon thing was almost upon them, its massive form blotting out the sun, its hunger so profound it seemed to warp the air around it. Silas raised his pistol for a final futile gesture of defiance. Then Delia was moving, faster than thought, her knife in her hand. Before anyone could stop her, she drove the blade across her own palm, opening a deep cut that welled with bright red blood. "I traveled with the thieves," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I offered them shelter in my camp. I knew what they'd done, knew what they'd taken, and I said nothing. Under your law, Joseph, under the law of the spirits, I'm complicit. My blood carries the debt just as surely as theirs."
"Delia, no," Silas started, but she cut him off with a look. "I've spent my whole life paying for other people's sins, Deputy. My father's, my husband's. Every man who ever decided my life was worth less than his ambitions." She turned to Joseph, holding out her bleeding hand. "Let me choose this. Let my death mean something. Let it be mine." Joseph hesitated for only a moment, then nodded with deep respect. "Your sacrifice will be remembered. Your courage will be honored. Your blood will seal the binding and save countless lives." The white knife rose, catching the afternoon sun, reflecting light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the mortal world. Silas grabbed Delia's shoulders, turning her to face him. "You don't have to do this. We'll find another way. There's always another way." "No," she said gently, her storm gray eyes meeting his with absolute clarity. "Sometimes there isn't another way. Sometimes the only choice is between dying for something or dying for nothing. I choose something." "I don't even know you," Silas said, the words inadequate but true. "Not really. Just a few days. Just this nightmare." "You know me better than most people who've known me for years." She smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it reached her eyes. "You saw me as a person, not a criminal or a possession or something to be used. That's worth more than you know." She kissed him then, quick and fierce, a moment of connection in the midst of death and chaos. Then she pulled away and turned to Joseph, her shoulders square, her head high. "I'm ready." The white knife found her heart with mercy and precision. She gasped once, her eyes going wide. Then her expression softened into something approaching peace. Silas caught her as she fell, lowering her gently to the altar stone where her blood joined the others, completing the circle, fulfilling the debt. The effect was immediate and devastating. The altar stone blazed with light so bright it bleached color from the world, reducing everything to stark white and absolute black. The standing stones around the clearing erupted with power, beams of pure energy connecting them in a web of ancient binding. The boon thing screamed, a sound of rage and terror and the terrible knowledge of defeat. Its body began to smoke and burn, not with fire, but with something purer and more absolute. The corruption that had sustained it, that had twisted it into a mockery of human form, began to unravel. Other creatures throughout the clearing suffered the same fate, their bodies collapsing, the Wendigo's power fleeing before the restored binding. Some dissolved into ash and memory, others transformed back into the corpses of the men they'd been before corruption claimed them. All of them found release from the curse that had made their deaths meaningless and their resurrection a nightmare. Joseph stood at the center of the altar, his hands raised, his voice rising in the final words of the binding ceremony.
The blood of the 6 sacrifices flowed into the channels carved in the altar stone, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometries that existed in dimensions beyond normal perception. The light intensified until Silas had to look away, his eyes streaming, his vision reduced to white noise and after images. He heard the Boon Thing's final scream, a sound of ancient hunger being denied, of corruption being purged, of evil being forced back into the prison from which it never should have escaped. Then silence. Absolute and complete. When Silas could see again, the clearing had transformed. The standing stones were dark, their symbols no longer glowing. The altar stone was clean, all traces of blood vanished as if it had never been. The bodies of the sacrificed were gone, leaving only memories and the weight of their choices. The Boon Thing lay at the edge of the clearing, reduced to a withered husk that barely resembled anything that had once lived. The other creatures had vanished entirely, leaving nothing but scorched earth where they'd fallen. Joseph Broken Wing stood before the altar, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with satisfaction. "It is done," he said quietly. "The binding is restored. The Wendigo is sealed once more in the sacred ground, trapped by the blood of those who freed it and the courage of those who chose to end it." "She's gone," Silas said, his voice hollow. He looked at his hands, still warm with the memory of holding Delia as she died. "They're all gone. Their sacrifice will be remembered," Joseph said. "I will ensure it. The story will be passed down, kept alive in the old tongue and the new. They died with honor. They died with purpose. Their deaths had meaning." "Does that make it hurt less?" "No," the old man admitted, "but it makes it bearable, and sometimes that's enough." The remaining survivors gathered in the clearing as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Sarah knelt where Mary had fallen, her hands pressed to the ground as if she could still feel her friend's presence in the earth. Corbin sat with his back against one of the standing stones, his face blank with shock and exhaustion. Chen lay where he'd fallen, his wounded legs useless but his eyes clear and aware. "What happens now?" Chen asked. "To us, I mean. To those of us who survived." Joseph moved among them, checking wounds with gentle hands, offering what comfort he could. "You leave these mountains. You return to the settlements and tell no one what happened here. The world is not ready to believe in what you've seen. They will call you mad or liars or worse. So you carry the truth in silence and you honor the dead by living well." "And the infection?" Chen looked at his wounded arm, at the black lines that had begun to spread from the claw marks. "Am I still dying?" Joseph examined the wound carefully, then pressed his hand against it and spoke words in the old tongue. The black lines receded, fading until they disappeared entirely, leaving only the clean cuts of normal injuries. "The binding's restoration purged the corruption," Joseph said. "You are free of the curse. Your wounds will heal naturally, given time and proper care." Relief washed across Chen's face, so profound it brought tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." They stayed in the clearing until full dark, too exhausted to move, too traumatized to face the descent. Joseph built a small fire and performed a ceremony of cleansing, walking among them with smoke and sacred herbs, chanting words that eased the weight of horror, if not erasing it entirely. When he came to Silas, the old man paused, studying him with eyes that saw too much. "You bear the heaviest burden," Joseph said, "the burden of command, of making choices that send others to their deaths. That weight will stay with you, deputy. It will color every decision you make for the rest of your life." "She didn't have to die," Silas said, the words raw. "I should have found another way." "Could you?" Joseph's voice was gentle but unflinching. "Or are you torturing yourself with the illusion of control?" Delia Cross made her choice freely. She chose meaning over emptiness, purpose over survival. Honor her choice by accepting it, not by drowning in guilt that serves no one. "How do I do that?" "By living. By continuing to make hard choices and bearing the weight of them. By being worthy of the sacrifice she made." Joseph placed his hand on Silas's shoulder. "She saw something in you worth dying for. Don't prove her wrong." They descended the mountain at first light, a ragged group of survivors carrying injuries both visible and hidden. The trail seemed easier somehow, as if the mountain itself had released its grip, allowing them to pass without the malevolent resistance that had marked their ascent. They found the remains of their original camp, picked through what supplies remained usable, and began the long journey toward Fort Callahan. They moved in near silence, each person wrapped in their own thoughts, processing trauma that would take years to fully comprehend. On the third day of descent, they encountered a cavalry patrol riding up from the fort. The lieutenant in charge took one look at their condition, the wounds, the haunted eyes, the reduced numbers, and asked what had happened. "Animal attacks," Silas heard himself say, the lie smooth and practiced. "Mountain cats. Took several members of our party before we could reach safety." The lieutenant accepted the explanation without question. Why wouldn't he? The alternative was madness, spirits, and curses, and ancient evils that the modern world had no framework to understand or accept. They reached Fort Callahan 4 days later, stumbling through the gates like refugees from a war no one else had witnessed. The fort surgeon took charge of their medical care, setting bones, stitching wounds, treating infections with clinical efficiency that couldn't touch the deeper injuries. Silas filed his official report, listing the dead and providing the accepted explanation. Animal attacks in the high country, a tragic but understandable outcome given the dangerous terrain and harsh conditions. No one questioned it. No one suggested anything supernatural or unexplainable might have occurred. The survivors dispersed slowly, each finding their own way forward. Sarah Pruitt took a stage east, returning to family she hadn't seen in years, seeking comfort in familiar faces and the routines of normal life. James Corbin joined a freight company heading west, choosing movement over stillness, action over reflection. Robert Chen accepted a position as bookkeeper in the fort's quartermaster office, his sharp mind finding solace in numbers and ledgers that made sense when nothing else did. Silas remained at the fort, filing paperwork, processing the end of his escort mission, preparing to return to duty. He moved through the motions of normal life, but something fundamental had changed. The world seemed thinner somehow, less solid, as if he could see through the facade of civilization to the darkness that lurked beneath. He was sitting in the fort's saloon, nursing a whiskey that he couldn't taste, when Joseph Brokenwing found him. The old man materialized beside him as if from thin air, his presence drawing no attention from the other patrons despite his traditional dress and bearing. "I'm returning to the mountains," Joseph said without preamble. "The binding is restored, but it requires maintenance, vigilance. Someone must keep watch, ensure the wards remain strong, prevent others from making the same mistakes that nearly destroyed us all." "Alone?" Silas asked. "For now. Perhaps in time I will find apprentices, people willing to learn the old ways, to understand that some knowledge cannot be allowed to die." Joseph's dark eyes studied Silas with unsettling intensity. "You could be one of them. You have the strength, the will, the understanding that comes from having looked into darkness and survived." Silas considered it, truly considered it. The idea of walking away from the star pinned to his chest, from the law and order he dedicated his life to upholding and embracing something older and stranger. But in the end, he shook his head. "I'm needed here. In the world of men and laws and civilized order, someone has to stand between the frontier and the chaos beyond. Someone has to believe that we can build something better, something lasting, even knowing what lurks in the shadows." Joseph nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "Then continue your work, deputy. Uphold your laws. Build your civilization. But remember what you learned in those mountains. Remember that there are powers older than your courts, debts that cannot be paid with money or time served, and that sometimes the only justice is the kind written in blood and sacrifice." "I'll remember," Silas promised. The old man stood to leave, then paused. "She asked me to give you something, Delia Cross, before the end." He placed a small object on the table, a locket on a tarnished silver chain. Silas opened it with trembling fingers and found 2 miniature portraits inside. One showed a woman who might have been Delia's mother, young and smiling. The other showed a man who could only have been her father, stern-faced and proud. "She said you should know where she came from," Joseph explained. "Who she was before the world broke her down and built her back harder. She wanted you to remember that the woman who died on that altar wasn't just a criminal or a prisoner or a sacrifice. She was a person who loved and hoped and dreamed before circumstances made her into something else." Silas closed the locket and fastened the chain around his neck, the silver cold against his skin. "Thank you," Joseph laid a weathered hand on his shoulder. Honor the dead by living well, deputy. That's all any of us can do. Then he was gone, disappearing into the fort's evening crowds as silently as he'd appeared, leaving Silas alone with his whiskey and his memories and the weight of a locket that held more meaning than its silver was worth. The next morning, Silas Vane collected his gear, his badge, and his official reassignment orders. He was being transferred to a settlement 200 miles south, a rough mining town that needed a lawman willing to stand firm against claim jumpers and violent disputes. It was dangerous work, the kind that got men killed regularly. He accepted without hesitation, because Joseph was right. Honoring the dead meant living well, living with purpose, making the sacrifices matter by doing the work they'd died to make possible. As he rode out of Fort Callahan, the mountains behind him stood silent and watchful, their peaks touched with snow that would last until spring. Somewhere up there, an old man walked sacred paths and tended wards that kept ancient evil contained. Somewhere in that high country, the spirits of 6 people who'd given their lives for balance and restoration found whatever peace the dead could claim. And somewhere deep in the earth beneath a burial mound, something old and terrible and hungry, weighted in chains of blood and stone and sacrifice, sealed away from the world it had nearly consumed, held in check by the courage of those who'd refused to let darkness win. Silas touched the locket beneath his shirt and rode south toward whatever future waited, carrying the truth in silence and the weight of command in every choice he made, a lawman who'd looked beyond the law and understood that sometimes justice required more than a badge and a gun could provide. The first gray light of dawn crept through the smoke hole like a hesitant visitor, touching the carved symbols on the stone walls and making them seem to shift and breathe. Silas hadn't slept. None of them had. They'd spent the dark hours listening to the creatures prowling outside, their hunting calls growing more desperate as the night waned and their power weakened with the approaching sun. Joseph Broken Wing sat near the entrance stone, his eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer or incantation. Whatever protection the old man had woven around them had held through the worst of it, but Silas could see the exhaustion written in the deep lines of his face. This kind of spiritual warfare took a toll that bullets and blades never could. "How much further to the burial ground?" Silas asked, his voice rough, from breathing the cold air and stone dust. Joseph opened his eyes. 2 hours if we move fast. Less if we're willing to take the direct route across the high ridge. The direct route puts us in open country, Garrett said from where he slumped against the far wall. The swagger had been beaten out of him by terror and loss. No cover, no place to run if those things come at us in daylight. The Wendigo's power diminishes with the sun, Joseph replied. It will not attack openly while light holds, but it will shadow us, test us, wait for any moment of weakness. And when we reach the burial ground, Delia's voice cut through the discussion like tempered steel. She sat with her back straight despite the exhaustion that must be weighing on her, the rifle across her knees, her eyes sharp and calculating. What happens then? Joseph met her gaze with something that might have been respect. Then we restore the balance. The 6 who remain from the original theft must willingly enter the sacred ground and face judgment. If they show true remorse, if they understand the gravity of their violation, the spirits may accept their lives as atonement and allow us to reseal the binding. And if they don't show remorse? Sarah Pruitt's voice was barely a whisper. She'd been silent since losing Thomas, her grief a living thing that threatened to consume her. Then the Wendigo will take them anyway, but their deaths will serve no purpose. The binding will remain broken, and the corruption will continue to spread until these mountains are nothing but a graveyard that no living soul dares enter. 6 men. Silas did the count in his head. Garrett and his remaining man makes 2. Boone is already dead, along with 3 others from your crew. That's 6 total. Garrett's face went white. Wait, you're saying even the dead ones count toward the debt? The debt was incurred by 7. 7 must pay. Joseph's voice held no mercy. The spirits care nothing for convenience or survival. They care only for balance. This is insane. Garrett was on his feet now, pacing the confined space like a caged animal. You're asking us to walk into certain death based on some old superstition about appeasing angry ghosts. I'm offering you a chance to die with purpose instead of terror, Joseph said. To mean something in your final moments instead of becoming just another vessel for corruption. That's more than most men get. The second of Garrett's men, a thin, nervous man named Cole, who'd barely spoken since joining the group, began to laugh. It was a broken, desperate sound that made everyone turn to stare at him. "We're already dead," Cole said, his eyes too bright, his hands shaking. "Don't you get it? We were dead the moment Boone broke that seal. Everything since then has just been the world catching up to what we already are. Corpses that haven't stopped moving yet." "Cole?" Garrett started. "No." Cole stood, swaying slightly. "No more lies, no more running. I'm done." He turned to Joseph. "If my death can end this, then take me now. Let it mean something. Let it stop." Joseph studied the man for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Your courage honors you. When we reach the sacred ground, the spirits will know your heart. That may be enough." They moved the entrance stone as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, flooding the world with light that seemed thin and unconvincing after the horrors of the night. The forest outside the stone lodge looked different in daylight, still dangerous, still wrong, but less immediately threatening. The creatures had retreated to wherever they sheltered from the sun, leaving behind only tracks in the dirt and bloodstains on the rocks. The group formed up with military precision that came from pure survival instinct. Joseph took point, navigating with the certainty of someone who'd walked these trails for decades. Silas and Delia flanked him, weapons ready, eyes scanning constantly for threats. The others followed in a tight cluster, nobody wanting to be the straggler who got picked off when attention wandered. They climbed. The trail rose sharply, following a ridgeline that offered spectacular views of the valley below and absolutely no cover from observation. Silas felt exposed, vulnerable, like an insect crawling across a giant's palm, waiting for the fingers to close. "There," Joseph said, pointing toward a saddle between two peaks where ancient stones stood in a circle that seemed too perfect to be natural. "The burial ground. Another hour if we maintain this pace." But they'd barely gone another 100 yards when Mary Dennison screamed. She'd stopped dead in the trail, staring at something in the trees to their left. Silas brought his rifle up, searching for the threat, but saw only forest and shadow. "What is it?" he demanded. "There." Mary's finger trembled as she pointed. "In the pines. A man. Standing perfectly still, watching us." Silas looked harder, and his blood turned to ice. She was right. There was a man standing among the trees, so motionless he'd been invisible at first glance. But now that Silas had seen him, he couldn't look away. The figure was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. It stood at an angle no living spine could maintain, its head tilted too far to one side, its arms hanging slack in a way that suggested broken bones and severed tendons. And even from 30 yards away, Silas could see the black emptiness where its eyes should have been. "Don't look at it," Joseph said sharply. "Don't engage. Keep moving." "But," Mary started, "it wants you to stop. Wants you to stare, to become transfixed. That's how it separates the herd." Joseph's voice carried absolute authority. "Eyes forward, keep walking." They obeyed, but it took every ounce of discipline Silas possessed not to look back. He could feel the thing's attention on them like a physical weight, pressing against his shoulders, trying to make him turn around. Then he heard it. Footsteps behind them, slow and deliberate. The sound of boots on stone matching their pace exactly. "It's following us," Corbin said, his voice tight. "Of course it is," Joseph replied. "Daylight weakens it but doesn't destroy it. It will shadow us until we reach the sacred ground. Once there, it cannot follow. The wards will hold even against what it has become." "What about the others?" Delia asked. "If one of the infected is following us, where are the rest?" As if in answer, more figures began appearing in the trees on both sides of the trail. They emerged from shadow like manifestations of nightmare, twisted bodies wearing the faces of the dead, moving with that same uncanny wrongness that marked them as vessels for something inhuman. Silas recognized one of them and wished he hadn't. Franklin Reed, who'd been taken on the second night, now stood among the corrupted. His chest still showed the terrible wounds that had killed him, but his body moved anyway, animated by hunger that transcended death. 7 of them, Robert Chen observed, his voice professionally calm despite the terror that must be eating at him. "Same number as the original thieves." "The Wendigo is making a point," Joseph said, "showing us what we face, demonstrating that every death feeds its power and increases the debt that must be paid." They walked faster, Not quite running, but close to it, the corrupted pacing them on both flanks like wolves following a wounded elk. The things made no move to attack, content to simply follow, their black eyes never blinking, their ruined mouths twisted into expressions that might have been hunger, or might have been rage, or might have been something no human emotion could encompass. The sun climbed higher, and the corrupted seemed to move slower, their steps becoming labored as if the light was physically painful. But they didn't retreat, didn't abandon the pursuit. They just kept coming with patient, terrible inevitability. Sarah Pruitt was crying as she walked, tears streaming down her face, her eyes locked on one of the twisted figures. "That's Thomas," she whispered. "That thing is wearing my husband's body." "Don't look at it," Mary said, gripping Sarah's arm. "It's not him anymore. It's just something wearing his face. He's in there somewhere. I can feel it. He's trapped inside that thing, screaming to get out." "He's dead," Delia said, her voice hard but not unkind. "Whatever that is, it's not the man you married. Thomas is gone, Sarah. You need to accept that." "How?" Sarah turned on her, anger cutting through the grief. "How do I just accept that my husband is dead and something evil is using his corpse like a puppet?" "The same way you accept anything on this frontier," Delia replied. "You survive it first. You grieve later. Right now we need you focused on staying alive." Thomas would want that. Sarah's face crumpled, but she nodded and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. When she started walking again, her spine was straighter, her jaw set with determination that spoke of strength forged in the furnace of loss. The circle of standing stones grew larger as they approached, resolving into a formation that was definitely not natural. Each stone stood twice the height of a man, carved with symbols so old they'd been worn smooth by centuries of wind and weather. The stones formed a perfect circle around a raised platform of granite, and even from a distance, Silas could feel the power radiating from the place, a thrumming in the air like the moment before a lightning strike. "We're close," Joseph said. "The sacred ground begins at those markers." He pointed to a line of smaller stones set in the earth, each carved with a single symbol that Silas didn't recognize but instinctively understood meant boundary, threshold, point of no return. The corrupted had stopped following. They stood at the edge of the tree line, forming a semicircle around the trail, blocking any retreat. But they came no closer, as if the sacred ground itself repelled them. "Why aren't they attacking?" Garrett asked, his hand white-knuckled on his pistol grip. "They're waiting," Joseph said. "Waiting to see if we'll enter the circle. Waiting to see if the debt will be paid voluntarily, or if they'll have to take what's owed. And if we refuse? If we just turn around and fight our way past them? Then they'll kill you and drag your corpse into the circle anyway. The debt will be paid, but your death will serve no purpose. The binding will remain broken, and everything we've endured will be for nothing." Garrett looked at the stone circle, then back at the corrupted things waiting in the trees. Silas could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the desperate search for an option that didn't end in death. "There has to be another way," Garrett said. "There isn't." Cole stepped forward, his face calm with the kind of peace that came from accepting the inevitable. "We did this, Pike. We broke the seal. We unleashed this horror. Now we pay for it. I didn't know, and doesn't matter. We knew we were robbing a burial ground. Knew it was sacred space. We just didn't care because we wanted the money." Cole turned to Joseph. "What do I need to do?" Joseph regarded him with something approaching respect. "Enter the circle. Stand before the platform. Speak your truth. Acknowledge your crime. Accept your punishment. If your heart is sincere, the spirits will recognize it. Your death will have meaning." Cole nodded, then turned to Garrett one last time. "You coming, or am I doing this alone?" Garrett's face worked through a dozen different emotions before settling on resignation. "Damn you, Cole. Damn you for being braver than me." He straightened his shoulders, trying to recover some of his earlier swagger. "Yeah, I'm coming. If we're going to hell, might as well arrive together." They walked toward the stone circle together, two men who'd lived by violence and greed now facing a reckoning they couldn't shoot their way out of. As they crossed the boundary markers, the air itself seemed to shift, becoming heavier, charged with potential energy that made the hair on Silas's arms stand on end. "The rest of you stay here," Joseph said. "What happens next is between them and the spirits." "What about the other 4 from the original crew?" Silas asked. They're dead but still count toward the debt. How does that work? Watch, Joseph said simply. Garrett and Cole reached the center of the circle and stood before the granite platform. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Cole began to speak, his voice carrying despite the distance. I came to these mountains as a thief and a violator of sacred ground, he said, the words seeming to cost him something to speak aloud. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I did it anyway because I wanted the money. Because I thought the old ways were just stories, and the dead couldn't hurt me. I was wrong. I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for what I unleashed. If my death can restore the balance, then take it. I'm ready. The moment he finished speaking, the corrupted burst from the tree line in a coordinated rush. They moved faster than Silas would have thought possible, covering the ground in seconds. But they weren't coming for the group outside the circle. They were heading straight for the sacred ground itself. Here they come, Delia said, raising her rifle. Don't shoot, Joseph commanded. This is part of it. This has to happen. The corrupted crossed the boundary markers and immediately began to change. Their twisted bodies straightened, bones cracking back into proper alignment, skin smoothing over wounds that had been fatal. For just a moment, they looked human again. Looked like the people they'd been before the Wendigo claimed them. Then they reached the center of the circle where Garrett and Cole stood waiting. What happened next would haunt Silas for the rest of his life. The corrupted surrounded the two living men, but instead of attacking, they simply stood there, their black eyes locked on Garrett and Cole. Then, one by one, they began to speak. The voices that emerged were the original voices of the dead, Reed, Thomas Pruitt, Marshall Hickman, and the others who'd been claimed. But layered beneath their tones was that horrible harmonic quality, multiple pitches woven together in a sound that hurt to hear. You broke the seal, they said in unison. You unleashed the hunger. You disturbed the sleep of ages. The debt must be paid in blood and truth. Garrett dropped to his knees, his courage finally failing. Please, he begged. Please, I didn't mean to. Intention is nothing. The voices cut across his plea like knives. Action is everything. You acted. Now face the consequence. Cole remained standing, his face set with quiet dignity. I accept the consequence, he said. I accept the debt. Take what's owed. The corrupted moved as one, their hands reaching out to touch Cole's face, his shoulders, his chest. Where they touched, his skin began to glow with a soft, silvery light that spread like frost across glass. Cole gasped but didn't cry out, didn't try to pull away. He simply stood there and let it happen. Your courage is noted, the voices said, softer now. Your acceptance honors the debt. You will feed the binding, and your death will have meaning. The light intensified until Silas had to look away. When he could see again, Cole's body was collapsing into ash that scattered on a wind that came from nowhere. The corrupted that had surrounded him now stood straighter, their faces peaceful, their eyes clearing from black to their natural colors as the Wendigo's influence receded. Then they too began to dissolve into light and ash, their bodies breaking down and flowing toward the granite platform where they swirled and coalesced into something that looked almost like a door, an opening into someplace that existed alongside the world, but separate from it. One debt paid, Joseph said quietly. 5 remain. Garrett was weeping openly now, curled into a ball at the center of the circle. I can't, he sobbed. I can't do it. I don't want to die. The corrupted, fewer now, but still present, turned their attention to him. Their expressions held no mercy, no sympathy, just patient, inevitable judgment. You will die regardless, they said. The only choice is whether your death serves the balance or feeds the corruption. Choose quickly. Our patience is not infinite. No, there has to be another way. There has to be... His words cut off as one of the corrupted lunged forward and grabbed him by the throat. This one wore the face of a man Silas didn't recognize, probably one of Boone's original crew who died early in the hunt. Its grip was iron, lifting Garrett off his feet like he weighed nothing. Then we take what's owed without your acceptance, the voices said, and your death means nothing. What followed was brutal and merciless. The corrupted tore into Garrett with their bare hands, ripping him apart in seconds, his screams echoing off the standing stones. But instead of the silvery light that had consumed Cole, Garrett's death released only darkness. Thick, oily shadows that pooled on the ground and seemed to writhe with malevolent life. A death without acceptance feeds the corruption instead of the binding, Joseph said, his voice heavy with regret. Garrett's death counts toward the numerical debt, but it strengthens the Wendigo instead of weakening it. This makes our task harder. What do we do now? Sarah asked, her voice small. The remaining 4 debts must be claimed from those already dead. The spirits will call them forth, judge their hearts as they were at the moment of death, and determine if their sacrifice was sufficient. Joseph moved toward the boundary markers, gesturing for the others to follow. Come. We must enter the circle and bear witness. This concerns all of us now. They crossed the threshold together, and immediately Silas felt the weight of ages pressing down on him. The air inside the circle was different, thicker, charged with power that made his skin prickle and his teeth ache. Every symbol carved into the standing stones seemed to pulse with its own internal light, creating patterns that shifted and flowed when he wasn't looking directly at them. The granite platform had become something more than stone. The doorway that had formed from Cole's sacrifice still hung in the air, rippling like heat shimmer, showing glimpses of someplace vast and empty and old beyond comprehension. From that opening came a wind that smelled of sage and snow, and something else, the metallic tang of old blood and ancient hunger. Then the dead began to emerge. They came through the doorway one at a time, their forms solidifying from smoke and memory into something that resembled human shape but carried none of the weight or substance of living flesh. Boone Mercer came first, his throat still torn open from the wound that had killed him, his eyes wide with terror that had followed him beyond death. The other 3 followed, men whose names Silas didn't know, whose crimes he could only guess at, whose deaths had been the first payments on a debt they hadn't understood they were incurring. The spirits of the standing stones, or whatever force governed this sacred ground, spoke through the mouths of the dead, using their voices to pronounce judgment. Boone Mercer, you led the violation. You planned the theft. You ignored the warnings. Your heart held no remorse, only greed. Your death feeds the corruption. Boone's spirit screamed as darkness consumed it, pulling it down into shadows that weren't shadows, but something worse. Absence given form, hunger made manifest. His essence disappeared into that terrible darkness, and the platform shuddered as if struck. 2 debts paid incorrectly, Joseph murmured. The binding weakens instead of strengthening. The next spirit was judged and found wanting, another death that fed the corruption instead of the balance. Then the third, who showed some measure of remorse but not enough, whose death was accepted but only barely, adding a thin thread of light to the binding instead of the strong cord that Cole's sacrifice had woven. The 4th and final spirit stood before the platform, and when the judgment came, Silas heard something different in the voices. You died trying to return what was stolen. You understood too late the gravity of your crime. You attempted atonement even knowing it would cost your life. Your remorse is genuine. Your sacrifice is accepted. This death transformed into brilliant light that flowed toward the platform and wove itself into the binding like golden thread through dark fabric. The doorway pulsed, expanding slightly, and through it Silas glimpsed something moving, something massive and hungry and very, very old. 4 debts claimed, Joseph said. 2 accepted, 2 rejected. The binding is weakened but not broken. We have one more chance to restore the balance before the Wendigo breaks free entirely. What more can we do? Delia asked. The 7 who stole the totem are all dead. The debt is paid numerically, even if the balance isn't satisfied. The numerical debt is settled, Joseph agreed, but the spiritual debt remains. The corruption that is spread, the lives taken by the Wendigo's influence, the terror unleashed upon the innocent, these require additional atonement. Someone must willingly sacrifice themselves to strengthen the binding, someone who bears no guilt for the original crime but chooses to act anyway. Silence fell across the group. No one moved. No one spoke. The implication was clear and terrible. Then Sarah Pruitt stepped forward. Thomas is gone because of this evil, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. He died in terror, taken by something that never should have been unleashed. If I can stop this, if I can make his death mean something, then I'm ready. Sarah, no. Mary grabbed her arm, but Sarah shook her off gently. What do I have left, Mary? My husband is dead. My home is gone. I came west looking for a new life, and all I found was grief and horror. Let my death serve a purpose. Let it end this.
You don't have to do this, Silas said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them.
Yes, I do.
Sarah turned to face the platform, her shoulders squared, her head held high. I've spent my whole life being afraid. Afraid of failure. Afraid of loss. Afraid of death. I'm done being afraid. If this is how I die, then let it be with courage and purpose. She walked to the center of the platform and stood before the doorway, her figure small and fragile against the vastness beyond. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the voices spoke again, but this time they held something that might have been respect. Sarah Pruitt, you carry no guilt for the violation. You have suffered loss because of evil you did not create. Yet you offer yourself freely to restore the balance. This is the highest form of sacrifice. Do you understand what you offer? I understand, Sarah said. I offer my life to strengthen the binding, to seal away the corruption, to make sure no one else suffers what I've suffered. Your offer is accepted. Your courage honors the spirits. Your death will have profound meaning. Light erupted from the platform, silver and gold woven together in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Sarah stood at the center of it, her body glowing with the same radiance that had consumed coal, but brighter, purer, stronger. She looked back at the group one final time, smiled through her tears, and spoke her last words. Tell my story, she said. Tell them I wasn't brave. Tell them I was terrified. But tell them I did it anyway. Then she was gone, transformed into pure light that flowed toward the doorway and wove itself into the binding with such force that the entire circle shook. The darkness that had seeped from Garrett and Boone's deaths was driven back, contained, compressed into something small and manageable that could be sealed away behind wards and prayers and the sacrifice of the innocent. The doorway began to close, its edges pulling together like a wound healing. Through the narrowing gap, Silas caught one last glimpse of the thing on the other side, the Wendigo in its true form, vast and terrible and endlessly hungry. It screamed as the doorway sealed, a sound of rage and frustration that echoed across dimensions and made every stone in the circle ring like a bell. Then silence fell, complete and absolute. The wind died, the light faded. The platform was just stone again, ancient and weathered and holding no trace of the power that had flowed through it moments before. It's done, Joseph said quietly. The binding is restored. The Wendigo is sealed. Sarah Pruitt's sacrifice was enough to tip the balance and lock the corruption away where it can do no more harm. They stood in the circle for a long time, none of them quite able to process what they'd witnessed. Eventually, as the sun climbed toward noon, they began to move toward the boundary markers and the world beyond the sacred ground. Silas was the last to leave. He turned back once, looking at the platform where Sarah had made her final stand, where Cole had shown courage in the face of judgment, where the debt of greed and violation had finally been paid in full. Rest well, he said to the empty air. Your sacrifice won't be forgotten. They descended from the high ground in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, their own grief, their own reckoning with what they'd seen and survived. The forest seemed different now, still dangerous, still wild, but no longer actively malevolent. The corruption had been sealed away, and nature was slowly reclaiming what should have always belonged to it. By the time they reached Fort Callahan 3 days later, their number had dwindled to 6: Silas, Delia, Mary, Corbin, Chen, and Joseph. They walked into the fort looking like survivors of a war nobody else had fought, bearing scars that went deeper than flesh, carrying stories that most people would never believe. The fort commander listened to their report with increasing skepticism, his expression suggesting he thought they'd all lost their minds to mountain fever or bad water. But he couldn't explain the empty homesteads they'd passed, the bodies they'd found, the 14 people who'd left Fort Granger and the 6 who'd arrived at Fort Callahan. In the end, he wrote it up as plague and predator attacks, added a note about avoiding the high country during winter months, and filed the report in a cabinet where it would gather dust and never be read. Silas stood on the fort's walls that evening, watching the sun set over the mountains they'd crossed, thinking about everyone they'd lost and everything they'd learned. You staying or moving on? Delia appeared beside him, her presence quiet but noticeable in the way she'd always commanded attention without demanding it. Don't know yet, he admitted. Part of me wants to put as much distance between myself and those mountains as possible. Another part feels like I need to stay, keep watch, Make sure what's sealed stays sealed. Someone should, Delia agreed. Someone who knows what's buried up there. What could happen if another fool decides to go digging for treasure in sacred ground? What about you? She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the mountains with eyes that had seen too much and survived anyway. The charges against me are going to stick. I was married to an outlaw, knew what he was doing.
Probably benefited from his crimes, even if I didn't participate directly. I'll stand trial, probably serve time. But I'm alive to do it. That's more than Reed or Thomas or Sarah can say. You could run, Silas said. I could say you escaped in the confusion. Nobody would question it. I could, she agreed, but I won't. I'm done running from what I am and what I've done. Sarah taught me that. She walked into certain death with her head held high and her purpose clear. The least I can do is face my own consequences with the same kind of courage. They stood together in companionable silence as the stars began to appear overhead, ancient lights marking patterns that had guided travelers long before white men came to the frontier and would continue long after the frontier was nothing but memory and legend. Joseph found them there an hour later, his weathered face peaceful in a way it hadn't been since they'd first met. The spirits are satisfied, he said without preamble. The balance is restored. The sacred ground is sealed. My people can return to the old ways without fear of what sleeps beneath. Will it hold? Silas asked. The binding? As long as the land is respected, as long as the warnings are heeded, as long as people remember that some things are sacred not because of superstition, but because the consequences of violation are real and terrible.
Joseph paused, then added, I will stay in these mountains. I will watch. I will teach those who are willing to learn. And if I see signs that the binding is weakening, I will know what must be done. And if it breaks again? Then we find another Sarah Pruitt, Joseph said simply. Another soul brave enough to stand against the darkness and say, this far and no further. The world always produces such people when they're needed most. The trick is recognizing them before it's too late. The weeks that followed were strange and disjointed, reality slowly reasserting itself in a world that had been turned upside down by terror and ancient evil. Mary Dennison found work at the fort's infirmary, her healing skills in constant demand on a frontier where doctors were rare and suffering was common. She never spoke about what happened in the mountains, but sometimes Silas would catch her staring at the high peaks with an expression of profound loss and hard-won wisdom. Robert Chen signed on as a scout for the Army, using his knowledge of the territory to guide patrol routes and mark safe passages through country that had claimed too many lives. He was efficient and professional and never volunteered information about the scars he bore or where they'd come from. James Corbin tried to go back to farming, staking a claim in the valley below the fort where the land was rich and the water was clean, but he couldn't make it work. Couldn't sleep through the night without waking to check the perimeter. Couldn't look at shadows without seeing shapes that weren't quite human moving through them. Eventually, he sold the claim and became a lawman, figuring that if he was going to live with fear, he might as well put it to use protecting people who didn't yet understand how thin the line was between civilization and chaos. Delia stood trial 6 weeks after reaching Fort Callahan. The prosecution painted her as a criminal's accomplice who'd enjoyed the benefits of stolen wealth. The defense argued she'd been a victim of circumstance, trapped in a marriage she couldn't escape. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and came back with a verdict of guilty on reduced charges, accessory after the fact, failure to report known crimes. The judge sentenced her to 2 years in the territorial prison, then suspended 18 months for time served in extraordinary circumstances. She walked out of this courthouse, a free woman, legally speaking, though Silas knew the real sentence would last much longer than any judge could impose. He was waiting for her on the steps, his deputy's badge still pinned to his chest, but feeling heavier than it used to. So what now, Mud? He asked. Now I live, Delia said. I find work. I build something that's mine and mine alone. I stop being defined by the men in my life, my husband, his gang, even you. She smiled slightly. No offense. None taken. He held out his hand. If you ever need anything, I won't, she said. But she shook his hand anyway. But thank you for treating me like a person instead of cargo, for trusting me when you had no reason to, for surviving with me when we both had every reason to die. She walked away down the street, her back straight, her head high, her future uncertain but entirely her own. Silas watched her go and felt something shift in his chest. Not quite loss, not quite relief, but something in between that might eventually become respect, and possibly friendship if they both survived long enough. As autumn turned toward winter, Silas found himself drawn back to the mountains. Not to the high country where the sacred ground lay sealed and guarded, but to the foothills where homesteaders were starting to return, emboldened by reports that the plague had passed and the animal attacks had ceased. He rode the territory, checking on families, helping with construction, lending his badge's authority to settle disputes before they became violence. And wherever he went, he told the story. Not all of it. Most people couldn't handle the full truth. But enough. Enough to make them understand that these mountains demanded respect, that some places were sacred for reasons that transcended religion or law, that greed and violation carried consequences that couldn't be escaped by running or fighting or pretending ignorance. Some people listened. Most didn't. But Silas kept telling the story anyway, because Sarah Pruitt had asked him to tell it, and that was a debt he could actually pay. 1 year after the sealing of the sacred ground, Silas rode back to the stone circle. He went alone, carrying supplies and a determination to see for himself that the binding held. Joseph was already there, tending to the standing stones, refreshing the symbols that had worn thin over the seasons. The old man looked up as Silas approached but didn't seem surprised. "I wondered when you'd come," Joseph said. "Had to see it," Silas replied. "Had to know it was real. That it wasn't just fever dreams or shared madness. It was real." Joseph gestured to the platform where Sarah had made her sacrifice. "The binding holds. The corruption is sealed. Your friends' deaths were not in vain." Small comfort. The only comfort the frontier offers. Joseph set down his tools and regarded Silas with those dark, knowing eyes. "You've changed. I can see it in the way you carry yourself, the weight you bear." "I've seen things that can't be unseen," Silas said. "Learned truths that can't be unlearned. You can't go back to normal after that." "No," Joseph agreed, "but you can go forward with wisdom, with understanding, with the knowledge that the world is larger and stranger and more dangerous than most people ever realize. That knowledge makes you valuable, makes you necessary." "To who?" "To everyone who walks these mountains in ignorance. Everyone who sees the wilderness as something to be conquered instead of respected. Everyone who thinks the old ways are just superstition and the warnings are just words." Joseph smiled slightly. "You are the bridge between worlds now, Deputy, between the civilization that pushes west and the ancient powers that were here first. That's a difficult position, but an important one." They stood together in the sacred circle as the sun set, painting the standing stones in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to make the carved symbols come alive. Silas thought about Sarah and Cole and Thomas and Reed and all the others who died to restore a balance they hadn't understood they were disrupting. "I'll remember," he said finally. "I'll tell the story. I'll guard against it happening again." "That's all any of us can do," Joseph replied. "Remember the dead. Honor their sacrifice. Prevent the same mistakes from being repeated. It's not much, but it's enough." Silas left the mountains as darkness fell, riding toward the distant lights of Fort Callahan with the weight of memory on his shoulders and the knowledge that some scars never healed, they just taught you how to live with pain. But he was alive to bear those scars. He'd survived what should have killed him a dozen times over. He'd seen courage in unexpected places and learned that strength came in forms that had nothing to do with guns or fists or badges. The frontier would continue its westward march. More settlers would come, pushing into territories that didn't belong to them, disturbing things that should remain buried. And when they did, when the old evils stirred and the ancient hungers woke, there would need to be people who knew what to do, people who understood the cost of violation and the price of restoration. Silas Vane rode into Fort Callahan that night, no longer just a deputy enforcing territorial law. He was something more now, a guardian of boundaries both physical and spiritual, a keeper of stories that most people would never believe, a witness to the terrible things that happened when greed overcame wisdom and ignorance overcame respect. The mountains rose behind him, dark and eternal and holding their secrets close. And somewhere high in the sacred ground, the binding held, sealed by sacrifice and strengthened by courage, and guarded by those who understood that some debts could only be paid in blood and truth
and the willingness to stand against the darkness, no matter the cost. The story was over. The dead were at rest. The evil was sealed away. But the frontier stretched on, vast and unforgiving and full of dangers both known and unknown. And as long as people walked those wild spaces with eyes closed and hearts hardened against the wisdom of the old ways, there would be need for those who'd survived the darkness and learned its lessons. Silas touched the badge on his chest, feeling its weight, understanding finally what it truly meant to wear it. Not just the authority to enforce laws written by men, but the responsibility to honor laws older than civilization, written in blood and sacrifice, and the terrible knowledge that some boundaries existed for reasons that transcended understanding. He was ready for whatever came next. Not because he was brave or strong or righteous, but because he'd seen what happened when people weren't ready. When they ignored the warnings and dismissed the old ways and believed that the world bent to human will. He'd seen the cost. He'd paid it alongside people braver than himself, and he'd make damn sure their sacrifice meant something. The frontier had no mercy, but it had memory. And as long as people like Silas carried those memories forward, as long as the stories were told and the lessons were learned, there was hope that maybe, just maybe, the next time evil stirred and ancient hungers woke, someone would be ready to stand against the darkness and say the words that Sarah Pruitt had taught them all. This far and no further. Not on my watch. Not again.